Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Rhythm in the Rain, from Marcus. The windshield wipers on my Peterbilt have always had their own personality. A steady back-and-forth rhythm that's kept me company through countless storms across the interstate highways of America. After 15 years of long-haul trucking, you learn to appreciate the small consistencies in life, and those wipers beating their mechanical heartbeat against the glass had become as familiar to me as my own pulse. Tonight, though, as I navigated through the worst downpour I'd seen in months, somewhere between Tulsa and Little Rock, that familiar rhythm was beginning to sound different. Almost like it was trying to tell me something. The rain had started just after midnight, a gentle pattering that gradually built into the kind of relentless torrent that turns highways into rivers and makes even experienced drivers like myself grip the wheel a little tighter. I'd pulled off at a truck stop about an hour back, checking my load of electronics bound for Memphis and grabbing a cup of coffee that was probably brewed sometime yesterday. The place had been nearly empty except for a few other drivers huddled over their meals, and I'd noticed a woman sitting alone in the back corner booth, her dark hair falling across her face as she stared out the rain-streaked window. Something about her had seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen her before. Back on the road, the wipers worked overtime against the deluge, their rubber blades squeaking occasionally against the glass in a way that made me wince. The rhythm was steady enough at first, a reliable swish-thunk that merged with the hum of my engine and the white noise of rain drumming against the cab. Mile after mile passed in this hypnotic pattern, the highway stretching endlessly ahead through my headlight beams, and I found myself settling into that meditative state that comes with night driving, where your mind drifts even as your hands remain steady on the wheel. It was somewhere around the 200-mile marker when I first noticed the irregularity. The wipers seemed to pause for just a fraction of a second longer than usual on their leftward sweep, creating a subtle break in their rhythm that caught my attention like a skipped heartbeat. At first, I attributed it to wear on the motor, or maybe ice building up despite the relatively warm temperature, but as the miles continued to roll by, the pause became more pronounced and, stranger still, more regular. Instead of the steady swish-thunk, it had become swish-thunk, pause, as if the wipers were deliberately emphasizing something. I tried adjusting the speed setting, cycling through the various intervals, but the strange pause persisted regardless of the timing I selected. The wipers would sweep right to left normally, but on the return journey from left to right, they would hesitate for that extra beat, and in that moment of stillness, I began to notice something else. During the pause, when the wipers were positioned at the leftmost edge of their arc, they seemed to frame something in my peripheral vision, something that wasn't quite part of the normal landscape of rain and darkness rushing past my window. The first few times I convinced myself it was just an optical illusion, a trick of shadows and refracted light through the water-streaked glass. But as the pattern continued, that brief pause happening over and over with mechanical precision, I began to see more clearly what appeared in that frozen moment. It looked like a silhouette, dark against the slightly less dark background of the storm, positioned just at the edge of my vision where the wiper blade came to rest. The shape was unmistakably human and unmistakably familiar. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as recognition dawned. It was the woman from the truck stop, the same dark hair, the same posture, standing motionless in the rain beside my moving truck. But that was impossible, wasn't it? I was traveling at 60 miles per hour through a storm that would knock a person flat, and she appeared to be keeping perfect pace with my rig, visible only during that strange pause in the wiper's rhythm, as if she existed only in that specific fraction of time. I tried to look directly at the spot where she appeared, turning my head to peer through the side window, but whenever I did, there was nothing there except rain and darkness. Only when I looked straight ahead, relying on my peripheral vision during that telltale pause, could I see her clearly. She wasn't walking or running to keep up with the truck. She simply existed there, moving at highway speed through the storm, her clothes and hair undisturbed by the wind that should have been battering her. The rational part of my mind cycled through explanations. Road fatigue maybe, or some kind of hallucination brought on by the hypnotic effect of the wipers in the late hour. I'd heard of drivers seeing things that weren't there after too many hours behind the wheel, phantom hitchhikers and ghost cars that vanished when you blinked. But this felt different, more deliberate, as if the timing of the wiper's pause was specifically designed to reveal her presence to me. As the miles continued to pass, she began to change position. At first she had appeared to be standing several feet away from the truck, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, she was getting closer. During each pause, that fraction of a second when the wiper blade framed my peripheral vision, she was a little nearer to the cab, her dark silhouette becoming more defined against the storm. I could make out details now that chilled me more than the air conditioning ever could. The way her hair hung in perfectly straight lines despite the wind, the unnatural stillness of her posture, and most disturbing of all, the fact that she seemed to be looking directly at me through the rain-streaked glass. I reached for my CB radio, thinking I might contact another driver, maybe get some perspective on what I was experiencing, but as my hand moved toward the microphone, the wiper rhythm changed again. Now the pause was longer, a full second of stillness that felt like an eternity, and in that extended moment of clarity, I could see her face. It was pale and expressionless, with dark eyes that reflected no light, and her mouth was moving as if she were speaking, though no sound penetrated the cab of my truck. My foot found the brake pedal almost involuntarily, and I began to slow down, thinking maybe I could break whatever spell or hallucination had taken hold of me. But as my speed decreased, she remained perfectly positioned beside the truck, still visible only during that mechanical pause, still keeping pace regardless of my velocity. When I tried to speed up again, she was still there, and I realized with growing dread that my speed wasn't the determining factor in her presence. The CB crackled to life with static, and through the white noise I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, distant and distorted but unmistakably female, and it was speaking in rhythm with the wiper blades. During each pause, during that moment when I could see her silhouette most clearly, the voice would whisper a single word through the radio speaker. At first the words were unintelligible, lost in static and interference, but as the miles passed they became clearer, more insistent. She was saying my name, not just Marcus, but my full name, my middle initial, even the nickname my mother had called me when I was a child. With each pause of the wipers, another piece of personal information crackled through the CB, details about my life that no stranger should know. My home address, the name of my ex-wife, the date I'd started driving long haul, even the contents of the load I was carrying. It was as if she had access to every file, every record, every private moment of my existence. I switched off the CB radio, but her voice continued, now seeming to come from the wiper motor itself, that mechanical grinding synchronizing with her whispered revelations about my life. The sound was soft but persistent, weaving through the noise of the engine and the rain, and I realized that she wasn't just beside my truck anymore. Somehow, impossibly, she had become part of it, integrated into the very machinery that was supposed to keep me safe on the road.
The next truck stop was still 50 miles away, according to my GPS, but I knew I had to get off the highway, had to break free from whatever was happening to me and my rig. I took the next exit I saw, a lonely off-ramp that led to a small rural town I'd never heard of, hoping that maybe a change of direction would disrupt the pattern that had trapped me. But as I navigated the winding two-lane road, the wipers continued their altered rhythm, and she remained visible during each pause, now so close to the truck that I could see the rain that should have been falling on her, but somehow wasn't. I pulled into the parking lot of a closed gas station, my hands shaking as I shifted into park and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of mechanical noise, but the wipers continued to move even with the engine off. Powered by some force, the rain had been falling for 3 hours straight when I first saw the exit sign for Crosswind Junction, a name that meant nothing to me but promised everything I needed: fuel, coffee, and a chance to stretch my legs before the final push to Denver. My Peterbilt's fuel gauge had been flirting with empty for the last 20 miles, and the steady thrum of 18 wheels on wet asphalt had settled into my bones like a familiar ache. The windshield wipers beat their hypnotic rhythm against the glass, clearing away sheets of water that seemed determined to blind me to whatever lay ahead in the dark. The truck stop materialized from the rain like something conjured from the void, its neon signs casting pink and blue halos in the mist that rose from the warm pavement. Most of the pumps stood empty under the fluorescent canopy, their digital displays cycling through advertisements for energy drinks and hot dogs with the persistence of casino slot machines. I guided my rig toward the diesel section, feeling the familiar satisfaction of a perfect backing maneuver as I aligned the cab with pump 7. The engine's rumble died away, leaving only the sound of rain drumming against the roof and the distant hiss of air brakes from other rigs scattered throughout the lot like sleeping giants. The fuel island felt different the moment I stepped down from the cab. The concrete beneath my boots seemed to pulse with a warmth that had nothing to do with the heated fuel lines running beneath the surface. The overhead lights buzzed with an intensity that made the rain look like silver needles falling from a black sky. And somewhere in the distance I could hear the low hum of electrical transformers working harder than they should have been on a quiet Tuesday night. The air tasted of ozone and diesel fumes, but underneath those familiar scents lurked something else, something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I approached Pump 7 with my credit card already in hand, eager to get back on the road and put some miles between myself and the strange feeling that had settled over me like a damp blanket. The pump's display screen flickered to life as I inserted my card, but instead of the usual prompts for zip codes and fuel grades, words began scrolling across the digital readout in letters that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Welcome, Marcus Henderson, driver of Peterbilt registration number KL4429. The screen read, though I had never given my name or truck information to any system at this particular stop. The cursor blinked expectantly beneath the greeting, waiting for some response I did not know how to give. I pressed the cancel button twice, but the display remained unchanged, the words pulsing gently like a heartbeat made visible. The rain continued its steady percussion on the metal canopy above, and I became aware that the other sounds of the truck stop, the hum of refrigeration units, the distant murmur of CB radios, the steady whoosh of traffic on the interstate had faded to almost nothing, as if the world beyond Pump 7 had been wrapped in cotton batting. New text appeared on the screen, scrolling slowly enough for me to read every word. We have been waiting for you, Marcus. Your tank holds 37 gallons when full. Your current fuel level is approximately 4 gallons. You require diesel fuel to continue your journey. We can provide what you need. The precision of the information sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through my jacket. No standard fuel pump had access to such specific data about my truck's fuel system, and certainly none had ever addressed me by name with such unsettling familiarity. I looked around the fuel island for security cameras or hidden speakers that might explain this elaborate prank, but the other drivers going about their business seemed oblivious to anything unusual. A woman in a yellow rain slicker was fueling her sedan at Pump 4, talking animatedly on her phone about delivery schedules and weekend plans. An older man at Pump 2 was cleaning his windshield with methodical precision, whistling softly to himself as he worked. Their normalcy made the strangeness of my situation feel even more pronounced, as if I had somehow slipped sideways into a reality where fuel pumps possessed knowledge they had no right to have. The screen flickered again and new text appeared. Payment can be made in the usual manner, or we can offer you an alternative transaction. Your fuel tank can be filled to capacity in exchange for something far more valuable than money. Consider our proposition, Marcus Henderson. Consider what you truly need to reach your destination. The words seemed to burn themselves into my retinas, remaining visible even when I closed my eyes and shook my head, trying to dispel whatever hallucination or electronic malfunction was causing this bizarre interaction. I tried removing my credit card and starting over, but the machine refused to return it, and the display continued cycling through its impossible messages. The sweet floral scent in the air grew stronger, mixing with the diesel fumes until the combination made me slightly nauseous. My hands trembled as I pressed various buttons on the pump's interface, seeking some way to return to the familiar world of zip codes and fuel grades and simple commercial transactions that made sense within the boundaries of normal experience. "The we require is simple," the screen continued. "What you call your soul can be transferred through this interface in exchange for fuel sufficient to take you anywhere you wish to go. The transaction is permanent but painless. You will notice no immediate difference in your daily experience. You will continue to feel emotions, make decisions, and live your life exactly as you do now. The change is subtle but eventually complete. Do you accept these terms?" Yes or no prompts appeared at the bottom of the screen, glowing softly in the perpetual twilight beneath the fuel island canopy. The rational part of my mind recognized this as either an elaborate hoax or a sign that I desperately needed sleep, But something deeper and more primitive began sounding alarm bells that I could not ignore. The pump seemed to be waiting with inhuman patience, its display screen pulsing in rhythm with the overhead lights, which had begun to flicker in patterns that hurt my eyes when I looked directly at them. The rain continued falling, but I noticed that none of it seemed to be landing on Pump 7 itself, as if some invisible barrier protected the machine from the elements that soaked everything else on the fuel island. The railway pressed the no button firmly, expecting the system to reset or possibly dispense my credit card so I could try a different pump. Instead, new text appeared almost immediately. Your current fuel level is insufficient to reach the next available fuel source. GPS tracking indicates the nearest alternative fuel is 47 miles away on Highway 82. Your vehicle's range with current fuel is approximately 32 miles under optimal conditions. Rain and headwinds will reduce this range significantly. Consider our offer carefully, Marcus Henderson. Pride is a poor companion for someone stranded on a dark highway. The accuracy of this assessment sent ice water through my veins because I knew the pump was absolutely correct. I had been pushing my luck with the fuel gauge for too long, gambling that I could make it to this stop. And now whatever malevolent intelligence controlled Pump 7 was exploiting my predicament with surgical precision. The nearest fuel on Highway 82 was indeed nearly 50 miles away, and my truck's fuel efficiency in these weather conditions would make reaching it impossible with what remained in my tank. The woman at Pump 4 finished her transaction and drove away, her taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. The man at Pump 2 followed shortly after, leaving me alone beneath the canopy with only the impossible fuel pump for company. The isolation felt complete and intentional, as if the universe had arranged circumstances to force this confrontation between myself and whatever entity now controlled the digital display that continued pulsing with patient malevolence. Your employment record shows 17 years of over-the-road trucking. The screen continued. You have a daughter named Sarah in Portland who expects you to attend her graduation ceremony on Saturday. You have never missed an important event in her life. Missing this milestone would cause both of you considerable emotional distress. Our offer remains available. Fuel for your soul. Transportation for your essence. A simple trade to ensure you reach your destination on schedule. The mention of Sarah's graduation ceremony convinced me that this was no mere electronic malfunction or elaborate prank. That information existed nowhere in any database connected to fuel pump systems, and the timing was impossibly precise. I had been thinking about her ceremony for the entire drive, worried about whether I would make it on time despite the weather delays and traffic slowdowns that had plagued my route since leaving Chicago. I stared at the yes and no buttons, weighing options that should never have existed outside of ancient folk tales and philosophical thought experiments. The rain drummed against the canopy with increased intensity, and I could hear thunder rolling across the prairie in slow, measured intervals that seemed to count down to some unstated deadline. My reflection in the pump's metal surface looked haggard and uncertain, the face of a man confronting a choice that defied all logic yet felt absolutely real in ways that transcended rational. Almost without conscious decision, my finger moved toward the yes button, drawn by necessity and fatherly love and the simple requirement of keeping promises to people who mattered more than abstract concepts like souls or spiritual integrity. But at the last possible second, the belt that binds. From Mark, the CB radio crackled with static as I adjusted my position in the driver's seat of my Peterbilt. The familiar weight of the seatbelt across my chest, a comfort I'd grown accustomed to over 15 years of long-haul driving. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon through the Nevada desert, broken only by the occasional cluster of neon signs promising gas, food, and rest to weary travelers like myself. It was past midnight, and the highway belonged to us night drivers now, the daytime traffic having long since disappeared into their warm beds and comfortable homes. I'd been making this run from Sacramento to Phoenix for the better part of a decade, carrying everything from electronics to produce, and I knew every mile marker, every truck stop, every place where the road dipped and rose through the desert landscape. Tonight's cargo was particularly valuable, a shipment of medical equipment bound for a hospital in Scottsdale, which meant I couldn't afford any delays or unexpected stops. The dispatcher had emphasized the urgency when he'd handed me the manifest, his usual casual demeanor replaced by something more serious, more pressing. The engine hummed with its steady, reassuring rhythm, a diesel lullaby that had become the soundtrack to my life on the road. Outside, the desert air was cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant rain through my slightly cracked window. The radio played soft country music, barely audible above the constant whisper of wind and tires against asphalt. Everything felt normal, routine, exactly as it should be during another solitary night crossing the American Southwest. As I approached a familiar rest area about 2 hours outside of Las Vegas, fatigue began to creep into my bones despite the strong coffee I'd consumed at my last stop. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:15 in the morning, and I realized I'd been driving for nearly 8 hours straight. Professional pride had always pushed me to go further than recommended, but even the most experienced drivers needed to respect the limits of human endurance. The rest area appeared ahead, its parking lot illuminated by harsh sodium lights that cast everything in an amber glow. I guided the truck into a parking space near the back of the lot, away from the few other vehicles scattered around the area. The routine was always the same: shut down the engine, grab my logbook, maybe walk around the rig to check the tires and cargo straps before settling in for a few hours of sleep in the sleeper berth behind my seat. My hand moved automatically to the seatbelt release button, the same motion I'd performed thousands of times before, muscle memory guiding my fingers to the familiar red plastic tab. But when I pressed the button, nothing happened. I pressed it again, this time with more force, expecting to hear the metallic click that would free me from the belt's embrace. Instead, there was only silence, the mechanism refusing to respond to my attempts at release. A small flutter of irritation rose in my chest as I tried once more, pressing and holding the button while pulling at the belt itself, thinking perhaps the fabric had become twisted or caught on something during the drive. The belt remained stubbornly locked in place, holding me firmly against the seat with an almost deliberate persistence that seemed to mock my increasingly frantic effort. I could feel my heartbeat beginning to quicken, a primal response to the sudden realization that I was trapped, confined in the very vehicle that had been my mobile sanctuary for so many years. The familiar comfort of the cab began to feel different, smaller somehow, as if the walls were gradually closing in around me. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm and analytical about the situation. Seatbelt mechanisms were fairly simple devices, and there had to be a logical explanation for the malfunction. Perhaps something had spilled into the release mechanism during one of my stops, or maybe the desert heat had caused some internal component to expand or warp. I reached for my small toolkit in the door pocket, extracting a thin screwdriver that might help me pry the mechanism open. Waking by the dim glow of the parking lot lights filtering through my windshield, I carefully probed around the edges of the seatbelt buckle, looking for any visible obstruction or damage that might explain its refusal to release. The metal felt normal under my touch, smooth and familiar, showing no signs of damage or foreign objects that might interfere with its operation. Yet no matter how I manipulated the release button, pressing it from different angles and applying varying amounts of pressure, the belt remained locked as securely as if it had been welded in place. A cold realization began to settle over me as I noticed something else disturbing about my situation. The seatbelt seemed tighter than it had been when I'd first stopped, pressing against my chest with a firmness that hadn't been there during the drive. I tried to lean forward, to create some slack in the belt, but found that it held me rigidly in place, allowing no movement beyond the most minimal shifting of my shoulders and arms. The parking lot around me remained eerily quiet, devoid of the usual sounds of late-night travelers and idling engines. Even the insects that typically filled desert nights with their constant chirping seemed absent, leaving only an oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. The amber lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting shifting shadows across my windshield that seemed to move with purpose rather than randomness. I tried my cell phone, thinking I could call for roadside assistance or perhaps reach another driver on the CB radio, but found that both devices showed no signal despite being in an area where coverage had never been a problem before. The isolation was complete now, cutting me off from any outside help or communication, leaving me alone with the increasingly uncomfortable pressure of the belt against my chest. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours as I continued my attempts to free myself from the belt's grip. I tried everything I could think of, from cutting at the fabric with my pocket knife to attempting to slip out of the belt by removing my shirt and jacket. But no matter what I did, the belt seemed to anticipate my actions, adjusting its grip to prevent any possibility of escape. The fabric itself felt different under my fingers now, less like the familiar nylon webbing I'd known for years and more like something organic, something that pulsed with a subtle rhythm that matched the beating of my heart. The temperature in the cab began to rise despite the cool desert air outside, and I could feel perspiration starting to bead on my forehead and neck. My breathing became more labored, whether from the physical pressure of the belt or from the growing panic that threatened to overwhelm my rational mind. The familiar interior of my truck began to feel foreign, hostile even, as if it had become something other than the vehicle I'd driven for so many miles across the country. Through my side mirror, I caught sight of movement near the edge of the parking lot, a figure that seemed to glide rather than walk across the pavement toward my truck. At first I assumed it was another driver coming to check on my situation, perhaps having noticed my prolonged stop or the unusual positioning of my rig. But as the figure drew closer, I realized there was something fundamentally wrong with its appearance, something that made my mind struggle to process what my eyes were seeing. The figure stopped just outside my driver's side door, and I could feel its presence even though I couldn't turn far enough to look directly at it. A soft tapping began against the metal of the door, rhythmic and patient, as if whoever or whatever was outside had all the time in the world to wait for my response. The seatbelt's grip tightened further, and I gasped as the pressure increased beyond what should have been physically possible for the mechanism to produce. Desperate now, I reached for the door handle, thinking that perhaps if I could open the door, I might be able to attract the attention of the figure outside, or at least change my situation in some way. But my hand froze as I grasped the handle, a sudden understanding washing over me that opening the door might invite something far worse than my current predicament into the confined space of the cab. The tapping continued, growing more insistent, and I could hear what sounded like whispering coming from just beyond the thin metal barrier of the door. The words were indistinct, spoken in a language I didn't recognize, but that somehow conveyed a sense of ancient authority, of claims being made and debts being called due. The belt continued its relentless tightening, and black spots began to dance at the edges of my vision as my breathing became increasingly difficult. Just as I felt consciousness beginning to slip away, my fingers found the emergency brake release, and in desperation I yanked it hard while simultaneously throwing the transmission into drive. The truck lurched forward with a tremendous grinding of gears, breaking whatever spell or influence had held me captive in the parking lot. The sudden motion seemed to shock the seatbelt mechanism back to normal function, and with a sharp click it finally released, allowing me to draw my first full breath in what felt like an eternity. They didn't stop to investigate what had happened or to look back at the figure that might still be lurking in the parking lot. Instead, I drove straight through to Phoenix, arriving at my destination as the sun was rising over the desert hills. The delivery went smoothly, the collection. From market, the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine had been my companion for the past 11 hours, carrying me through the winding darkness of rural Montana toward a delivery in Billings that couldn't wait until morning. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green 2:15 a.m., and the only other light came from the occasional flicker of distant farmhouse windows, scattered across the rolling prairie like fallen stars. Rain had started an hour ago, not heavy but persistent, drumming against the windshield in a rhythm that matched the diesel's heartbeat beneath my feet. I reached for my thermos of coffee, finding it disappointingly light, and realized I'd need to stop soon for fuel anyway. The gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and the next truck stop according to my GPS was still 40 miles ahead. That's when I saw the amber glow of a small roadside diner emerging from the darkness, its neon sign buzzing and stuttering against the wet night. Rosie's All-Night Cafe, it read, though half the letters flickered uncertainly, and beneath it a smaller sign promised fuel, food, rest. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few cars huddled close to the building, and one other semi-parked at the far end, near the diesel pumps. I pulled my rig alongside the fuel island, killed the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The rain seemed louder now, pattering against the cab roof with tiny metallic fingers, and I could hear the distant hum of the diner's neon sign cycling through its electric melody. As I climbed down from the cab, I noticed the other trucker filling his tank at the next pump over. He was an older man, maybe 60, with silver hair poking out from beneath a worn baseball cap and deep lines etched around his eyes. His truck was older than mine, a classic Kenworth from the 80s, midnight blue with chrome that still caught the light despite its age. He nodded as I approached, the universal greeting of drivers who spend their lives on the road. "Night like this makes you grateful for warm coffee and dry socks," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent decades breathing diesel fumes and cigarette smoke. I agreed, starting my own fuel pump and watching the numbers climb on the display. The rain continued its gentle assault, creating small rivers that ran between the concrete islands and disappeared into storm drains. "Been driving this route long?" I asked, making the kind of small talk that helps pass the time during these late-night encounters. Truckers are generally social creatures, despite spending so much time alone, and there's comfort in sharing stories with someone who understands the peculiar challenges of life on the highway. "Oh, must be going on 30 years now," he replied, topping off his tank and hanging up the nozzle. "Name's Earl, by the way. Earl Hutchins." We shook hands, his grip firm and calloused, and I told him my name was Marcus. "You know," he continued, glancing around the empty parking lot, "I've got something in my cab I think you might find interesting. You seem like someone who appreciates unusual." There was something in his tone that made me pause, a hint of excitement mixed with what might have been pride. The fuel pump clicked off, indicating my tank was full, and I found myself curious despite the late hour and my desire to get back on the road. Earl was already walking toward his truck, gesturing for me to follow, and something about his eagerness drew me along. His Kenworth's interior was immaculate, the kind of old-school craftsmanship you don't see much anymore. The seats were real leather, worn smooth by decades of use but still supple, and every surface gleamed with careful maintenance. Earl climbed into the driver's seat and patted the passenger side, inviting me to join him. The cab smelled of coffee, pine air freshener, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something faintly sweet and organic. "Been collecting these for years," Earl said, reaching toward the glove compartment. "Started almost by accident, but now it's become something of a passion project." His fingers worked the latch with practiced ease, and the compartment door swung open with a soft click. What I saw inside made my breath catch in my throat. Teeth, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, nestled in small cloth-lined compartments like jewelry in a display case. They were organized by type and size, from tiny children's teeth no bigger than rice grains, to massive molars that seemed too large to have ever fit in a human mouth. Some were pristine white, others yellowed with age or stained with dark spots that might have been decay or something else entirely. The collection filled the entire glove compartment, which seemed somehow larger on the inside than it should have been, extending back into shadows that the dome light couldn't quite reach. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Earl's voice carried a reverent whisper, and his eyes reflected the light with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Each one tells a story, you know. Each one came from someone special." He reached in and picked up a particularly large canine tooth, holding it up to the light like a jeweler examining a precious stone. "This one came from a truck driver, actually. Fellow named Bobby Garrett. Picked him up hitchhiking outside of Tucson maybe 15 years ago." The sweet smell was stronger now, and I realized it was coming from the glove compartment, a cloying odor like flowers left too long in water. My stomach began to churn, and I found myself gripping the door handle without really meaning to. Earl seemed not to notice my discomfort, lost in his examination of the tooth, turning it this way and that, in the pale light. "The trick," he continued conversationally, "is knowing which ones to take. You can't just grab any old tooth, you understand. They have to be special ones, from special people. People who won't be missed right away, or whose disappearance might be explained by the natural dangers of the road." He placed the canine tooth back in its designated spot and selected another one. This one smaller and more delicate. This little beauty came from a college girl I picked up in Oregon, Sarah something or other. She was hitchhiking to Seattle, running away from some boy trouble. Before I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but my throat felt dry and constricted. The rain continued drumming on the roof of the cab, but the sound seemed muffled now, as if we were underwater or buried deep beneath the earth. Earl's fingers moved among the teeth with loving care, caressing each one like a parent touching their sleeping child's face. "If you now and see you're impressed," Earl said, finally looking at me directly. His eyes in the dome light weren't quite the right color anymore, seeming to shift between brown and something darker, something that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "I was hoping you'd understand. Most people don't appreciate craftsmanship like this, the patience it takes to build a proper collection." The truck's cab suddenly felt much smaller, the walls pressing in around us, and I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Earl was still smiling, but the expression no longer seemed friendly. Instead, it reminded me of something predatory, the way a cat might look at a cornered mouse. His hand moved toward the glove compartment again, but this time he wasn't reaching for the teeth. Instead, his fingers wrapped around something metallic that caught the light with a cold gleam. "The thing about teeth," Earl continued, his voice taking on a dreamy quality, "is that they're the hardest part of the human body. They last longer than bones, longer than anything else. Long after everything else has turned to dust, the teeth remain. They're like little monuments, memorials to lives that might otherwise be forgotten." I lunged for the door handle, my survival instincts finally overriding the paralysis of shock and disbelief. The door swung open with a metallic groan, and I tumbled out into the rain, landing hard on the wet asphalt. Behind me I could hear Earl laughing, a sound like gravel sliding down a metal chute, and the dome light in his cab went out with a decisive click. My legs felt unsteady, but I managed to run toward my own truck, fumbling for my keys with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The rain soaked through my shirt within seconds, but I barely noticed, focused only on reaching the safety of my cab. Behind me I heard the sound of Earl's truck door slamming shut, followed by the rumble of his diesel engine turning over. I threw myself into my Peterbilt's driver's seat and turned the key, relief flooding through me as the engine caught on the first try. Through my side mirror I could see Earl's Kenworth pulling away from the fuel pumps, its chrome bumper gleaming wetly in the diner's neon glow. The truck moved slowly, almost leisurely, and I caught a glimpse of Earl's silhouette in the driver's seat, still wearing that predatory smile. I put my truck. The thing about driving a Peterbilt 309 for 15 years is that you know every sound she makes, every vibration that travels through her frame, every whisper of wind that finds its way past the weather strip. My rig and I have crossed this country more times than I can count, through desert heat that makes the asphalt shimmer like water and mountain passes, where snow builds up on the windshield faster than the wipers can clear it. So when something changes, when there's a sound that doesn't belong, you notice it right away. It started on Highway 60 in Nevada, somewhere between Tonopah and Ely, in that vast stretch of nothing, where the desert rolls on forever under a sky so big it makes you feel like an ant. The moon was just a silver crescent hanging low on the horizon, and my headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness ahead. The radio was playing some late-night talk show, the host's voice a comforting drone about UFO sightings and government conspiracies, the kind of background noise that helps keep you alert on these long hauls. I was making good time with a load of electronics bound for Denver, the trailer tracking straight and true behind me. The engine was humming its familiar song, that deep, steady rumble of diesel power that had lulled me through countless nights. Everything was normal, everything was as it should be, until I heard the first footstep. It came from behind me, in the sleeper berth area, a soft but distinct sound like someone shifting their weight from one foot to the other. I glanced in the rearview mirror knowing full well that I was alone in the cab, but checking anyway because that's what you do when something doesn't make sense. The sleeper berth was dark, just shadows and the faint glow of my reading light that I'd left on. I turned down the radio and listened, counting the seconds in my head, waiting for the sound to repeat. but there was nothing except the drone of tires on asphalt and the whistle of wind around the mirrors. I figured maybe it was just the truck settling, some cargo shifting in the trailer, or perhaps my imagination playing tricks after too many hours on the road. But then it happened again, clearer this time, unmistakably the sound of a footstep on the floorboard of my sleeper berth. Not the creak of metal or the shift of cargo, but the deliberate pressure of a foot meeting floor, followed by another step and then another. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I slowed the rig down, pulling over to the shoulder. The air brakes hissed as I brought the truck to a stop, and I engaged the parking brake with more force than necessary. In the sudden quiet with the engine idling and no road noise to mask other sounds, I sat perfectly still and listened. A step, a slow, measured footsteps moving back and forth in my sleeper berth, pacing like someone lost in thought or perhaps waiting for something. The sound was soft but clear, and with each step I could feel a slight vibration through the cab, the way you'd feel if someone was actually walking around back there. I reached for my flashlight and turned in my seat, shining the beam into the sleeper area. The light revealed nothing but my rumpled sleeping bag, the small television mounted on the wall, and the storage compartments where I kept my clothes and personal items. But as I watched, I heard another step, and I swear I saw the sleeping bag move slightly. Just a tiny depression in the fabric as if an invisible foot had pressed down on it. The desert wind picked up outside, sending tumbleweeds skittering across the highway and rattling the side panels of the trailer. I killed the engine and climbed into the back, flashlight in hand, determined to find a logical explanation. Maybe there was a loose panel vibrating in just the right way to create the sound, or perhaps something had gotten caught in the air conditioning system. I checked every inch of the sleeper berth, running my hands along the walls, testing the floor panels, examining the storage compartments. Everything was solid. Everything was as it should be. But when I knelt down to check the floor more carefully, I heard the footsteps again, this time directly above my head. That stopped me cold because above the sleeper berth, there was nothing but the roof of the cab and open sky beyond. I stood up slowly, my heart starting to race, and that's when I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. My breath was visible in the beam of the flashlight, small puffs of white vapor that shouldn't have been there in the warm desert night. The temperature in the cab had dropped at least 20 degrees in the span of just a few minutes. I could see my breath, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket, a bone-deep chill that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The footsteps continued above me, pacing back and forth on what should have been empty air. I scrambled back to the driver's seat and started the engine, not caring about finding an explanation anymore, just wanting to put distance between myself and whatever was happening in my truck. But as I released the parking brake and pulled back onto the highway, the footsteps followed me. They moved through the cab with purpose now, no longer confined to the sleeper berth. I could hear them on the floor beside me, and occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, like a shadow that moved independently of any light source. The cold intensified and frost began forming on the inside of the windows despite the heater running full blast. Mile after mile, the footsteps continued their restless pacing. Sometimes they'd pause right behind my seat, and I'd feel a presence there, close enough that the hair on the back of my neck would stand up. Other times they'd move to the passenger side, and I'd hear the distinct creak of the seat springs, as if someone had sat down, though the seat remained visibly empty. Near Austin, the footsteps stopped moving and seemed to settle in the passenger seat. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, afraid to look directly at the spot where I knew something was sitting, but I could sense it there, a weight and presence that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The radio had gone to nothing but static, and even the engine seemed quieter, muffled somehow. Then I heard something that nearly made me drive off the road, the soft sound of breathing that wasn't my own. It was slow and measured, perfectly synchronized with the rise and fall of what should have been an empty chest. In the corner of my eye, I could see the passenger seat depressing further, as if whatever was sitting there was leaning back to get comfortable. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the rig faster than I should have on the winding mountain roads, desperate to reach the truck stop in LA where there would be lights and other people and some semblance of normalcy. But the faster I drove, the more agitated my invisible passenger became. The breathing grew more rapid, and the footsteps resumed, now accompanied by other sounds: rustle of fabric, the soft tap of fingers against glass, and occasionally what sounded like whispered words in a language I couldn't understand. Tio. When I finally pulled into the truck stop, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the air brake. I left the engine running and practically fell out of the cab, grateful to feel solid ground under my feet. The parking lot was bathed in harsh fluorescent light, and there were a dozen other trucks lined up in neat rows, their drivers either sleeping or grabbing coffee in the travel center. I walked around my rig twice, looking for anything unusual, any sign of what might have caused the sounds and sensations I'd experienced. But the Peterbilt looked exactly as she always did, road-worn but solid, her chrome bumper reflecting the parking lot lights and her exhaust stacks pointing toward the star-filled sky. It wasn't until I climbed back into the cab that I noticed the real evidence of what had happened. There, pressed into the cushion of the passenger seat, was the clear indentation of a human form. The fabric was compressed in the exact shape of someone sitting there, someone who had settled in for a long ride, and on the window beside the seat, spelled out in the condensation that had formed during those cold miles, was a single word written in what looked like a child's handwriting: home. I stared at that word for a long moment, my mind racing through possibilities and explanations, none of which made any sense. Then I reached out and wiped the condensation away with my sleeve, erasing the message but not the memory of it. The rest of the trip to Denver passed without incident. No footsteps, no cold spots, no invisible passengers. But every now and then, when I'm driving alone through the darkness, I'll glance at that passenger seat and wonder about the word on the window. Was someone trying to get home? Or had they already found it? And if they'd found it, what did that mean for me and my truck, traveling these endless highways with a passenger? The first thing you learn as a long-haul trucker is that highways have personalities. Some roads hum with friendly chatter over the CB radio, filled with voices sharing weather reports and speed trap warnings. Others stay quiet, but you can still hear the familiar sounds of civilization, the distant rumble of traffic, the occasional air horn echoing across the miles. Then there are roads like Highway 82 through the Nevada desert, where something else entirely waits in the darkness between the mile markers. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 389 for 17 years when I first encountered that stretch of asphalt that runs through what locals call the Whisper Valley. The name should have been my first warning, but truck stops are full of colorful names for ordinary places. Dead Man's Curve, Devil's Backbone, Hell's Half Acre. Most of the time, they're just dramatic labels slapped onto perfectly normal roads by drivers with too much imagination and too much coffee. It was a Tuesday night in late October when dispatch routed me through that particular slice of nowhere. I was hauling electronics from Reno to Phoenix, running behind schedule due to a blown tire outside Carson City. The replacement road would shave 40 minutes off my drive time, threading through a valley I'd somehow never traversed despite nearly 2 decades of crisscrossing the Southwest. My CB radio crackled with the usual evening chatter as I approached the turnoff, drivers discussing fuel prices and a multi-car pileup backing up traffic on the main interstate. The transition was subtle at first. As my headlights swept across the reflective Highway 82 sign, I noticed the CB radio growing quieter. Not unusual, really. Plenty of remote stretches have poor radio reception. The desert can play tricks with signals, bouncing them off mountains or swallowing them entirely in dead zones created by mineral deposits underground. I adjusted the squelch and checked my antenna connection, but the voices continued to fade until only static whispered through the speaker. The road itself seemed ordinary enough in those first few miles. 2 lanes of well-maintained blacktop stretched ahead, flanked by the typical sagebrush and scattered Joshua trees that populate the Nevada backcountry. My diesel engine maintained its steady rhythm, and the familiar vibration of the road traveled up through the steering wheel into my hands. The dashboard lights cast their usual amber glow across the cab, and the GPS showed a straight shot through the valley with no significant elevation changes or sharp curves to navigate. Yet as I settled into the drive, something began to feel wrong in a way I couldn't immediately identify. It started with my own humming. I have a habit of humming along with the engine drone, usually old Johnny Cash songs or whatever tune happens to be stuck in my head. That night, it was Ring of Fire, a song that had been playing at the truck stop where I'd grabbed dinner. I hummed the opening bars, but the sound seemed to fall flat inside the cab, as though the air itself was absorbing the melody before it could reach my own ears. I tried humming louder, then switched to whistling, but the effect remained the same. The sounds felt muffled and distant, as though I were hearing them through thick glass or from the bottom of a swimming pool. Even more disturbing, when I stopped making noise entirely, the usual sounds of the truck itself seemed diminished. The engine still rumbled beneath the hood, but quieter than it should have been. The air brakes still hissed when I tested them, but the sound arrived delayed and dampened. 20 minutes into the valley, I reached for my CB radio and keyed the microphone. Breaker 19. This is Big Wheel Marcus looking for a copy. My voice sounded strange even to me, flattened and lifeless in the confines of the cab. I waited for a response, but only static answered. I tried again, broadcasting on different channels, calling for any truckers who might be running parallel routes on distant highways. Nothing. The silence grew heavier as I continued deeper into the valley. Even my tires on the asphalt seemed to whisper instead of hum. I rolled down my window, expecting to hear the rush of wind and the louder growl of the engine, but the outside air brought no increase in volume. If anything, the open window made everything quieter, as though the desert night was actively pulling sound away from my truck and swallowing it whole. In swallowing it whole, I checked my speedometer and was surprised to see I was traveling nearly 10 miles per hour slower than I'd intended. The truck felt normal, the engine responding properly to the accelerator, but something about the road seemed to be dampening not just sound, but motion itself. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, watching the speedometer climb back to my intended 70 miles per hour, but within minutes it had drifted down again without my noticing. The GPS showed I was approaching the halfway point through the valley when I noticed the other vehicles. At first they were just distant lights in my mirrors, headlights that appeared and disappeared around the gentle curves behind me. Nothing unusual about that, except for the fact that the lights never seemed to get any closer or further away, maintaining a constant distance despite changes in my own speed. I slowed down deliberately, dropping to 55 miles per hour, but the lights behind me remained exactly where they had been. More unsettling was what happened when I tried to use my radio to contact whoever was following me. I broadcast repeatedly, describing my location and asking the other driver to respond, but my words seemed to die in the air before they could travel more than a few feet from the antenna. The radio itself was working properly, the transmission light glowing green each time I keyed the microphone, but I began to suspect that my signals were being absorbed by the same force that was stealing all the other sounds in the valley. As I crested a small rise, I saw additional lights ahead of me. 2 sets of taillights glowed in the distance, moving at exactly the same speed I was traveling. Like the headlights behind me, they maintained their position no matter how I adjusted my velocity. When I sped up, they remained precisely where they had been. When I slowed down, the distance stayed constant. It was as though we were all locked in some kind of invisible convoy, bound together by rules I didn't understand. I tried using my horn, sending out the standard truck greeting of 2 long blasts followed by 3 short ones. The sound that emerged was barely audible even inside my own cab, a weak honking that seemed to dissolve into the night air within yards of my truck. The vehicles ahead and behind gave no indication they had heard anything at all. We continued our strange procession through the valley in perfect, terrible silence. The landscape around us began to change as we moved deeper into whatever phenomenon had captured us. The Joshua trees grew sparser and took on twisted shapes that looked wrong even in the dim backwash of my headlights. The sagebrush seemed to lean away from the road, as though the plants themselves were trying to avoid the strip of asphalt that cut through their territory. Most disturbing of all, I began to notice pale shapes scattered throughout the desert on both sides of the highway. At first I thought they might be rocks or maybe the bleached bones of cattle that had wandered away from some distant ranch. But as my headlights swept across them, I realized they were vehicles. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, and RVs sat motionless in the sand. Their paint faded to the same ghostly white color. Some appeared to be recent models, while others looked like they had been sitting in the desert for decades. None of them showed any signs of damage or mechanical failure. They simply sat there silent and empty, as though their drivers had pulled over and walked away into the dark. I wanted to stop, to investigate the abandoned vehicles and maybe find some clue about what was happening in this valley. But my truck seemed reluctant to reduce speed. Every time I eased up on the accelerator, the engine would surge slightly, as though some external force was encouraging me to maintain momentum. The brake pedal still responded to pressure, but using it required more effort than usual, and I found myself reluctant to fight against whatever was pulling me forward. The lights ahead and behind maintained their positions as we approached what my GPS indicated was the far end of the valley. I should have been relieved to see the exit approaching, but instead I felt a growing sense of urgency, as though something important was about to happen and I needed to be ready for it. The radio static had changed frequency, cycling through different patterns of white noise that almost sounded like whispered conversations in languages I couldn't identify. As we reached the valley's edge, marked by a sign welcoming travelers to Lincoln County, the spell began to break. Sound returned gradually, starting with a faint whisper and building to normal levels over the course of several hundred yards. My engine resumed its familiar rumble, my tires found their voice on the asphalt, and my CB radio suddenly exploded with chatter as signals from across the region flooded back into range. I immediately keyed the microphone and called out to the other drivers who had been traveling with me through the silent zone. Breaker 19, this is Big Wheel Marcus calling for the convoy that just came through Highway 82. I waited for responses from the interstate stretched endlessly before me like a black ribbon unfurling through the Nevada desert, my Peterbilt's headlights carving twin tunnels through the darkness that seemed to swallow everything beyond their reach. It was past 2 in the morning, and the radio had been cycling through nothing but static for the last 100 miles. The familiar voices of late-night DJs fading into electronic snow as I pushed deeper into the wasteland between Reno and Salt Lake City. The hum of my diesel engine provided a steady rhythm beneath the soft whisper of wind across my windshield, and I found myself settling into that meditative state that comes with long hauls through empty country. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to produce across the western states, and I knew every truck stop, every hill, every stretch where cell towers grew sparse and radio signals became unreliable. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the distant lightning flickering along the horizon. The static on my CB radio seemed thicker than usual, almost viscous in its quality, and several times I'd reached for the dial thinking I'd heard something buried in the white noise, only to find nothing but the endless hiss of empty frequencies. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks after too many hours behind the wheel. A sound within the static, soft and rhythmic, like breathing or perhaps the distant echo of waves against a shore. I adjusted the squelch and fine-tuned the frequency, but the sound remained elusive, dancing just at the edge of perception. My coffee had grown cold in its thermos, and I poured myself another cup with one hand while keeping my eyes on the yellow lines that seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, as if the road itself had a heart. The crying began around mile marker 2047. Emerging from the radio static like a voice surfacing from deep water. At first it was so faint that I mistook it for the wind whistling through a gap in my windowsill, but as I listened more carefully, the sound resolved into something unmistakably human. A woman's voice, distant and distorted, weaving through the electronic interference with a sadness so profound it made my chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. I reached for the volume knob, turning it up slowly, and the crying grew clearer, more distinct, punctuated by occasional words I couldn't quite make out. The desert around me seemed to respond to the sound, shadows shifting in ways that defied the steady beam of my headlights, and I noticed that the usual scatter of small animals that typically darted across the roadway had vanished entirely. Even the insects that normally spattered against my windshield were absent, leaving the glass unnaturally clean except for a thin film of dust that caught the dashboard lights like scattered stars. The crying from the radio continued, rising and falling in waves that seemed to match the gentle hills of the landscape, and I found myself leaning forward, straining to catch every nuance of the mysterious voice. By mile marker 251, the crying had developed a pattern, almost like a song without melody, and I realized I could distinguish individual words floating in and out of clarity. Lost came through distinctly, followed by something that might have been cold or gone, and then a phrase that sounded like "find me please," stretched across several seconds of static. My hands had begun to sweat despite the cool night air flowing through my vents, and I noticed that my speedometer needle was trembling slightly, as if the truck itself was responding to some invisible vibration. The woman's voice grew stronger as I crested a low hill, and suddenly I could hear her as clearly as if she were sitting in my passenger seat, though the static remained, creating an otherworldly backdrop to her words. She was speaking about a road, describing turns and landmarks in a voice thick with tears, and with growing unease I realized she was describing the very highway I was traveling. She mentioned the twisted Joshua tree at mile 249, which I had passed just minutes before, and the abandoned gas station at mile 252, which I could already see in the distance, its broken neon sign flickering weakly against the star-filled sky. As I approached the gas station, the crying voice became urgent, almost frantic, describing how she had stopped there for help, how her car had broken down, how someone had promised to call for assistance but never returned. The building looked exactly as she described it, down to the faded Coca-Cola sign hanging at an odd angle, and the single overhead light that cast sickly yellow pools across cracked concrete. I slowed my rig, considering whether to stop and investigate, but something in the quality of the light, the way it seemed to bend and waver despite the still air, made me keep driving. The radio crying followed me past the station, growing more desperate with each passing mile, and now I could hear other sounds mixed with the static, the distant rumble of engines, the slam of car doors, footsteps on gravel that crunched with crystalline clarity through my speakers. The woman's voice had taken on an echo, as if she were calling from the bottom of a well, and she was pleading now, begging someone to answer, to help, to not leave her alone in the dark. My rearview mirrors showed only empty road behind me, but I had the unsettling sensation that something was following just beyond the reach of my taillights. At mile marker 257, the static began to change, taking on a rhythmic quality that reminded me of a heartbeat, and within that pulse the woman's crying had become a litany of names, each one spoken with careful precision despite her obvious distress. "Sarah Morrison," she said, and then Jennifer Walsh and Patricia Dunn, a roll call of the lost that seemed to stretch on forever. I realized with cold certainty that these were not random names but a memorial, a listing of others who had shared her fate, and my foot eased off the accelerator as the horrible implications settled over me. The road ahead curved gently to the left, following the contours of a dry riverbed, and as I navigated the turn, my headlights swept across something that shouldn't have been there. A cluster of vehicles parked along the shoulder, their shapes barely visible in the darkness, and as I drew closer I could see they were old cars from different eras, a collection spanning decades, all positioned as if their drivers had simply pulled over and walked away. The crying from the radio had stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums, and in that silence I heard the soft sound of my own breathing, ragged and too fast. One of the cars, a sedan from the 70s with oxidized paint that looked black in my lights, had its driver's door standing open, and I could see papers scattered on the ground beside it moving slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. My CB radio crackled back to life, but instead of crying I heard footsteps, dozens of them, walking on asphalt with the slow, measured pace of a funeral procession. The sound seemed to be coming from all around me, though the highway remained empty, and I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel as I pressed the accelerator, eager to put distance between myself and whatever was happening at that roadside gathering. But as my speedometer climbed past 70, then 80, the footsteps kept pace, never falling behind, and now they were accompanied by voices, whispers that seemed to seep through the static like water through sand. I could make out fragments of conversation, women's voices discussing routes and schedules, weather conditions, and the loneliness of long drives through empty country. They spoke of truck stops and rest areas, of kind drivers who had helped with flat tires or offered directions, and gradually I understood that these were the voices of travelers, women who had found themselves alone on dark highways, seeking help that had come at too high a price. The whispering grew louder as I approached mile marker 260, and among the voices I heard the original crying woman, no longer weeping but speaking in the same matter-of-fact tone as the others. She was describing my truck, noting the company logos on my trailer, the pattern of my clearance lights, even the slight vibration in my left mirror that I had been meaning to fix for weeks. "Blue Peterbilt," she said with clinical precision, "traveling eastbound. Driver appears to be alone. Good candidate for approach vector 7. My blood turned to ice water as I realized I was being hunted, tracked by something that had learned to mimic distress, to broadcast crying and pleas for help that would appeal to the basic decency of travelers like myself. The abandoned cars I had passed were not the vehicles of victims but trophies, a collection that grew each time someone stopped to investigate the source of the radio transmissions. I switched off my CB and AM/FM receivers, but the voices continued, now emanating from my speakers with crystal clarity, discussing strategies and timing as if I were merely another problem to be solved. The mile markers began flashing past more quickly as I pushed my rig to its limits, the diesel engine roaring with the strain, but still the voices followed. Now, the right headlight on my old Peterbilt died somewhere outside Amarillo, Texas, leaving me half blind as I pushed through the endless stretch of highway. It was one of those bone-cold October nights where the wind carries whispers of winter, and the darkness beyond my remaining headlights seemed thicker than usual, like black velvet pressed against the windshield. I should have pulled over at the next truck stop, should have fixed that light or at least waited for dawn, but I was already behind schedule, and the dispatchers don't care much for excuses these days. The broken headlight hung there in its socket like a dead eye, the glass spider-webbed from where a stone had caught it earlier that afternoon. Every few miles I'd glance over at it through the side mirror, and something about the way it sat there bothered me more than it should have. Maybe it was the way the cracks in the glass caught the moonlight, creating patterns that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Or maybe it was just the loneliness getting to me, the way it always does on these long hauls through the middle of nowhere. The radio had been nothing but static for the past hour, and the heater was starting to lose its battle against the creeping cold that seeped through every gap in the cab. I reached for my thermos of coffee, now lukewarm and bitter, and took a sip while keeping one eye on the road ahead. The asphalt stretched out like a gray ribbon beneath my one working headlight, and beyond its reach, the world simply ceased to exist. That's when I first noticed the reflection in my passenger side mirror. At first I thought it was just another truck approaching from behind, but as the minutes ticked by, the light never got closer or farther away. It just stayed there, constant and steady, like a distant star that had decided to follow me down this lonely highway. I adjusted the mirror to get a better look, but all I could see was that single point of light, perfectly round and unnaturally bright against the darkness. The engine hummed its familiar tune, a low rumble that usually comforted me during these solitary drives. But tonight it seemed different somehow, as if there were harmonics in its rhythm that I'd never noticed before. The diesel smell that normally filled the cab had taken on an odd sweetness, like flowers left too long in a vase, and I found myself checking the gauges more frequently than necessary, though everything appeared normal. As I crested a small hill, the light behind me suddenly vanished, and for a moment I felt relief wash over me like cool water. But when I looked ahead, there it was again, that same perfect circle of light, now somehow positioned in front of my truck, moving along the road at exactly my speed. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I pressed the accelerator, pushing the old Peterbilt up to 70, then 75. The light ahead maintained its distance, never wavering, never changing. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was another trucker's headlight, or perhaps some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, one of those strange tricks that the desert plays on tired minds. But deep in my chest, something cold and primitive whispered that I was wrong, that whatever I was following or being followed by wasn't bound by the same rules that governed 18-wheelers and diesel engines. The broken headlight in its socket began to make a sound, a faint clicking that started sporadically and then settled into a steady rhythm, like a metallic heartbeat. I reached up to adjust my rearview mirror and froze. In the reflection, I could see that the damaged headlight was no longer dark. The cracked glass was glowing with a soft phosphorescent light that pulsed in time with that clicking sound, and within the web of fractures, shapes seemed to move and dance. I pulled my eyes back to the road just in time to see that the light ahead had stopped moving. It hung there in the darkness like a beacon, and as I approached, I could see that it wasn't on the highway at all, but floating perhaps 10 feet above the asphalt, perfectly still and impossibly bright. My foot found the brake pedal, and the truck began to slow, air brakes hissing their protest into the night air. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The light wasn't coming from any earthly source I could identify. It was simply there, a sphere of luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, and around its edges, the air itself appeared to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this was October, and the temperature outside was barely above freezing. Behind me, the broken headlights clicking grew more insistent, and when I glanced in the mirror again, I saw that the glow from the cracked lens had intensified. The patterns within the fractured glass were definitely moving now, swirling and coalescing into shapes that almost looked like faces. Expressions of longing and desperation pressed against the inside of the glass like prisoners trying to escape. I brought the truck to a complete stop about 50 yards from the floating light, engine idling roughly in the thin air, and reached for my CB radio. Static poured from the speaker like electronic rain, but underneath the white noise I could hear something else, a voice or maybe several voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were calling to me, inviting me to step out of the cab, to come closer to the light, to bring the broken headlight with me. The passenger door handle turned by itself with a soft click, and the door swung open, letting in a rush of air that carried scents of ozone and something floral and cloying. The voices from the radio became clearer, more insistent, and I realized they were coming not just from the speaker but from the broken headlight as well, emanating from somewhere within its fractured depths. Every instinct I had screamed at me to put the truck in gear and drive, to flee this place and whatever impossible thing was happening here, but my hands wouldn't obey. Instead, I found myself reaching for the door handle, preparing to climb down from the cab and walk toward that impossible light. The broken headlight's glow had become so bright that it was casting shadows inside the cab, and in those shadows I could see movement, figures that beckoned and gestured for me to hurry. It was only when my boot touched the first step leading down from the cab that some deeper part of my mind finally broke free from whatever hold had been placed on me. I jerked my foot back, slammed the door shut, and jammed the gear shift into drive, pressing the accelerator to the floor. The truck lurched forward, diesel engine roaring its defiance into the night, and I aimed directly for the space beneath the floating light. As I passed under it, the cab filled with a sound like wind chimes made of ice, beautiful and terrible, and every piece of glass in the truck, the windshield, the mirrors, the gauges, began to crack in perfect spirals radiating outward from their centers. The broken headlight exploded in a shower of phosphorescent fragments that dissolved into nothing before they hit the pavement, and suddenly I was driving through normal darkness again, with only my one remaining headlight to guide the way. I didn't stop driving until I reached Oklahoma City, didn't even slow down except for fuel, and when I finally pulled into a truck stop and looked in the mirror, the passenger side headlight socket was empty, as if there had never been a light there at all. The mechanic who looked at it the next morning said it was the strangest thing he'd ever seen, metal twisted in ways that didn't make sense, as if something had reached out from inside and pulled the entire assembly into another dimension. I still drive that route sometimes, though I always make sure to travel during daylight hours now. But on cloudy days when the sun is hidden and the world takes on that gray, uncertain quality, I sometimes catch glimpses of light in my mirrors, moving just at the edge of perception. And I've learned to avoid trucks with broken headlights, because late at night when I pass them on the highway, I can see the glow beginning to pulse within their fractured glass, and I know that somewhere out there in the darkness between towns, something is still waiting, still calling out to lonely drivers on empty roads, still hoping to find its way back to our world through the broken eyes of dying lights. The growing lock. From Marcus, the interstate stretched before me like a black ribbon under the pale October moon, my 18-wheeler humming its familiar tune as I made my way through the Nevada desert toward Salt Lake City. 23 years I'd been driving these routes, hauling everything from furniture to farming equipment, but I'd never seen a trailer quite like the one I picked up that evening from the depot outside Reno. The paperwork was standard enough, manifest listing it as containing vintage mechanical parts bound for a restoration company in Utah, but something about the trailer itself made the hair on my arms stand up every time I walked past it during my pre-trip inspection. The trailer was older than most I'd hauled, painted a deep forest green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested it had been sitting in that depot lot for longer than anyone cared to admit. What caught my attention immediately was the lock securing the rear doors, a massive brass mechanism that looked like something you might find on a Victorian mansion rather than a cargo trailer. The thing had to weigh at least 10 pounds, with intricate scrollwork and patterns etched into its surface that seemed to shift and change when you weren't looking directly at them. When I asked the dock supervisor about it, he just shrugged and said the shipper insisted on using their own security, which wasn't unusual in my line of work, so I signed the bills and hooked up without giving it much more thought. The first few hours of the drive passed without incident, my CB radio crackling occasionally with chatter from other drivers, the steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me, providing its usual comfort. The desert landscape rolled by in shades of gray and silver under the moonlight, punctuated by the occasional cluster of lights marking some small town or truck stop. It wasn't until I stopped for fuel at a lonely station near the California-Nevada border that I first noticed something odd about that lock. As I walked around the trailer during my routine inspection, checking the tires and lights, I could have sworn the brass mechanism looked different somehow, larger perhaps, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what had changed. The fuel station was one of those old-fashioned places that seemed frozen in time, with a single attendant who looked like he'd been working there since the Eisenhower administration, and a pair of ancient gas pumps that wheezed and groaned as they filled my tanks. While I waited, I found myself drawn back to that trailer lock, studying its ornate surface in the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the station's canopy. The patterns etched into the brass seemed more elaborate than I remembered, with new swirls and curves that definitely hadn't been there during my pre-trip inspection. I ran my fingers over the metal, feeling the intricate ridges and valleys, and I could have sworn I felt a faint vibration, like a pulse or heartbeat, coming from deep within the lock itself. Back on the road, I tried to push the strange feeling aside and focus on making good time to my destination, but I found my eyes constantly drifting to the mirrors, checking on that trailer behind me. The lock wasn't visible from the cab, of course, but somehow I could feel its presence back there, growing heavier and more substantial with each passing mile. The radio chatter seemed muted now, distant voices discussing weather conditions and traffic reports fading into background noise as my attention became fixated on the cargo I was pulling through the night. Around 2 a.m, I pulled into a rest area to grab a few hours of sleep, though I knew rest wouldn't come easily. The parking area was nearly empty except for a couple of other big rigs spaced far apart, their drivers presumably catching some shut-eye in their sleepers. I went through my usual routine, checking the trailer one more time before settling in for the night, and that's when I saw what the lock had become. The thing was enormous now, easily twice the size it had been when I had first laid eyes on it, its brass surface gleaming dully in the sodium lights of the rest area. The intricate patterns had multiplied and spread across its face like living vines, creating a maze of curves and spirals that hurt to look at directly. I stood there for what felt like hours, transfixed by the impossible sight before me, my rational mind trying to come up with some explanation for what I was witnessing. Maybe it was fatigue playing tricks on me, or perhaps the original lock had been some kind of expandable mechanism designed to provide extra security during transport. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, I could feel the truth settling into my bones like winter cold, the understanding that whatever was inside that trailer was somehow feeding the lock, making it grow stronger and more complex with each passing hour. The sound started around 3:30, a low humming that I felt more than heard, vibrating through the ground and into the soles of my boots. At first I thought it might be coming from one of the other trucks, an engine running to power a sleeper unit's air conditioning, but the frequency was wrong, too organic and rhythmic to be mechanical. I pressed my ear to the trailer's side panel and felt the vibration intensify, accompanied now by what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't understand, voices speaking in urgent overlapping conversations that seemed to emanate from the cargo itself. Sleep was impossible after that, so I climbed back into the cab and started the engine, eager to put distance between myself and that rest area, though I knew the source of my unease was traveling with me. The lock continued to grow as I drove through the pre-dawn darkness, its weight apparently having no effect on the trailer's handling, but its presence becoming more oppressive with each mile. I found myself checking the mirrors obsessively, watching for signs that the rear doors might be bulging outward or that the lock might be spreading to cover more of the trailer's surface. As the sun began to rise over the Utah mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I got my first clear daylight look at what the lock had become. The brass mechanism now covered nearly half of the trailer's rear doors, its surface writhing with patterns so complex they seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could properly process. Tendrils of metal had begun to spread along the door frame, growing like some kind of metallic fungus, and I realized with growing horror that the lock wasn't just expanding, it was taking over the entire trailer, sealing whatever was inside more completely with each passing hour. The whispers were constant now, audible even over the rumble of the engine and the whistle of wind past the cab. Sometimes they seemed to be calling my name, Marcus, 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 in voices that sounded almost familiar, like relatives or friends from long ago trying to get my attention. I turned up the radio to drown them out, but the voices seemed to adapt, growing louder and more insistent, until I was forced to acknowledge that they weren't coming through the air but directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. By the time I reached the outskirts of Salt Lake City, the entire rear of the trailer had been consumed by the growing lock, its brass surface now covering both doors completely and beginning to spread along the sides. The delivery address led me to an industrial district on the wrong side of town, where warehouses and manufacturing plants squatted between weedy lots and rusted chain-link fences. The building I was looking for turned out to be an old brick structure with painted-over windows and a loading dock that looked like it hadn't seen use in decades. I backed up to the dock with trembling hands, my usual precision compromised by exhaustion and growing dread, and waited for someone to come out and sign for the delivery. The whispers had stopped sometime during the final approach, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse than the constant murmuring had been. Minutes passed, then an hour, with no sign of movement from the building, no response to my knocking on doors or peering through grimy windows. I was beginning to think I'd been given the wrong address when I heard the sound of metal grinding against metal coming from behind me. The lock was opening itself, its impossible mechanisms turning and clicking in a sequence that defied understanding, brass tendrils retracting and folding back to reveal the trailer's interior for the first time since I'd picked up the load. But there were no vintage mechanical parts inside, no restoration equipment or industrial supplies, just row upon row of empty hooks and chains hanging from the ceiling like a slaughterhouse that had never been used. The trailer was completely empty, had probably been empty all along, and I realized with dawning horror that I had been the cargo, the thing being delivered to this abandoned building in this forgotten corner of the city. I ran then, abandoning my truck and trailer, sprinting through the industrial maze of warehouses and loading docks with the sound of grinding metal following close behind me. The lock was closing again, sealing itself back up, but I could hear footsteps now, multiple sets of feet moving in perfect synchronization, emerging from that empty trailer and beginning to pursue me through the morning streets. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, finally collapsing behind a dumpster in an alley miles from where I'd left my rig, gasping for breath and listening for sounds of pursuit. I've been driving these highways for 17 years now, hauling everything from electronics to livestock across the continental United States, and I thought I'd heard every sound the road could make. The whistle of wind through my cab's weather stripping, The rhythmic thump of tires finding every imperfection in the asphalt. The distant wail of train horns cutting through midnight air like lonesome ghosts. But there's one sound that still makes my hands tighten on the steering wheel. One sound that turns my blood to ice water every time I hear it echoing across the darkness. It started 3 months ago on a run from Phoenix to Denver, carrying a load of computer components that needed to reach the distribution center before dawn. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Interstate 25, a vast expanse of sagebrush and shadow under a star-drunk sky. My Peterbilt 379 hummed steadily beneath me, her 18 wheels eating up miles with the reliable rhythm I'd grown to love over nearly 2 decades on the road. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, voices floating through the static like messages from another world. I remember checking my watch as I passed the New Mexico state line. The dashboard lights cast everything in a soft green glow, and my thermos of coffee had grown lukewarm hours ago. But the caffeine still coursed through my system, keeping my eyes sharp and focused on the ribbon of highway ahead. That's when I first heard it, drifting across the desert air like something pulled from a half-remembered dream. A truck horn, not the sharp blast of a driver warning someone in their blind spot, or the friendly double-tap greeting that we give each other when passing on lonely stretches. This was different. A long, mournful note that seemed to hang in the air far longer than physics should have allowed. It rose and fell with an almost musical quality, like a foghorn calling ships through treacherous waters. But there was something underneath that melody, something that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the warm desert air flowing through my cab. I glanced at my side mirrors, expecting to see another 18-wheeler coming up behind me, maybe running without lights. But the highway stretched empty in both directions. The sound came again, that same haunting note, and this time I was certain it was coming from somewhere ahead of me, though I could see nothing but darkness and the endless line of reflective markers guiding my path northward. My CB radio had fallen silent, which struck me as odd because there's usually someone talking on the airwaves at any hour, especially through this corridor where drivers push hard to make their delivery windows. I reached for the handset and keyed the mic. Breaker 19, this is Nighthawk eastbound, on I-25 near mile marker 47. Anyone else hearing that horn out here? Static answered me, thick and heavy, with none of the usual background chatter that fills the trucker channels. The sound came a third time, and now I was certain it was happening at exactly 2:22 a.m. I watched my digital clock flip to that precise time as the horn began its eerie call, and something cold settled in my stomach like a stone. The note seemed to wrap around my truck, penetrating the steel and glass of my cab as if the walls were made of paper, vibrating through my bones until I felt it in my teeth. The sigh slowed down, dropping from 75 to 60, then 55. My eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of another vehicle. The horn faded gradually, leaving behind a silence that felt too complete, too absolute. Even the usual sounds of my truck, the steady diesel rumble, the whisper of air through the brake lines, the soft rattle of the gear shifter, seemed muted as if I were driving through cotton. That first night I convinced myself it had been some acoustic anomaly. Maybe the sound of a distant train horn distorted by the desert air and my own fatigue. But the next night, hauling a load of furniture from Albuquerque to Oklahoma City, I heard it again. Same time, same haunting quality. That mournful note that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. This time I was ready, my watch face illuminated as the seconds ticked toward 2:22. And when that horn began its ghostly call, I felt my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Week after week, no matter where I was driving, through the cornfields of Iowa, across the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, down the fog-shrouded coastal highways of Oregon, that horn would find me at exactly 2:22 a.m. I began to dread the approach of that time, watching my clock with growing anxiety as the minutes crept past 2 o'clock, knowing that somewhere in the darkness ahead, that sound would come drifting toward me like a message from the grave. Decided asking other drivers about it at truck stops and way stations, describing the sound as best I could, but they would just shake their heads and give me the kind of look reserved for someone who'd been on the road too long. "Maybe you need a vacation, Marcus," one old-timer suggested over coffee at a Flying J outside Nashville. "Sometimes the highway gets into your head, makes you hear things that ain't there." But I knew what I was hearing was real as the vibration of my engine, or the weight of the trailer behind me. The breakthrough came in the driver's lounge at a pilot station in Missouri, where I met a weather-beaten man named Dale who'd been driving longer than I'd been alive. When I mentioned the horn, his coffee cup froze halfway to his lips, and his face went pale beneath his tan. "What time?" he asked quietly, and when I told him 2:22, he set his cup down with shaking hands. "I heard it too," he whispered, glancing around the lounge as if afraid someone might overhear. "Started about 6 months ago, always at the same time. Thought I was losing my mind." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a breath. "Did some research, went to the library in my hometown, looked up old newspaper articles about truckers and highway accidents. Found something that made my blood run cold." Dale pulled out his phone and showed me a grainy photograph of a newspaper clipping from 1987. The headline read, "Truck driver dies in fiery crash after falling asleep at wheel." The article described how a long-haul trucker named William Morrison had been found at the bottom of a ravine in Colorado, his rig burned beyond recognition. The accident had occurred at 2:22 a.m., and witnesses reported hearing his horn blowing continuously as the truck left the highway and rolled down the embankment. "But here's the thing," Dale continued, his eyes fixed on mine. "Morrison wasn't the only one. I found 12 other cases, all truckers, all died at exactly 2:22 in the morning, all of them blowing their horns as they went off the road. Different years, different states, but always the same time." He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 60-plus years. "I think they're still out there, still trying to warn someone, still calling out in the darkness." That night, driving through Kansas with a load of medical supplies, I felt a new kind of dread as 2:22 approached. The highway stretched straight and empty ahead of me, disappearing into a horizon painted silver by a full moon. When the horn began its mournful call, I pulled my truck onto the shoulder and stepped out into the cool night air, my ears straining to pinpoint the source of the sound. The note seemed to come from directly ahead, maybe a mile or two up the road, and as I listened I began to hear something else underneath it. Other horns, fainter but unmistakable, creating a chorus of warning calls that made my skin crawl. I climbed back into my cab and drove slowly forward, following the sound like a sailor drawn to a siren song. What I found when I crested the next hill nearly made me jackknife my rig in shock. There, scattered along both sides of the highway for the next quarter mile, were the ghostly outlines of truck accidents. Not physical wrecks, but impressions in the air itself, like heat mirages, but made of shadow and memory. I could see the twisted shapes of cabs and trailers. Some rolled onto their sides, others buried nose first in invisible embankments, all of them flickering like badly tuned television channels. The horns were coming from these phantom wrecks, 13 different calls blending together in a harmony of tragedy and loss. As I watched, frozen in my driver's seat, I saw a figure climb out of one of the ghostly cabs, a tall man in a baseball cap and flannel shirt, his face pale in the moonlight. He looked directly at me and raised his hand, not in greeting but in warning, pointing past my truck towards something I couldn't see. I spun around to look through my rear window and felt my heart. The CB radio crackled to life just past midnight as I guided my Peterbilt down the empty stretch of Interstate 80 through Nevada's high desert. Static filled the cab for a moment before a woman's voice emerged, clear and strangely melodic despite the late hour. She called herself Radio Rose, and her voice had that warm, honeyed quality that made the lonely miles seem a little less endless. "Good evening, night riders," she said, her tone carrying an odd formality that seemed from another era. "This is Radio Rose, coming to you from somewhere between here and there, bringing you weather, road conditions, and a little company for those long, dark hours ahead." I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, and I'd never heard her frequency before. Channel 19 was usually filled with the familiar voices of regulars, truckers whose handles and stories I knew by heart. But Radio Rose spoke with an authority that commanded attention, rattling off weather patterns and construction delays with uncanny accuracy. Other drivers began chiming in, thanking her for updates about black ice near Reno and a multi-car pileup that somehow hadn't made it onto any of the traffic apps yet. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, sagebrush and Joshua trees creating twisted silhouettes against the star-drunk sky. My headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness, while the diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby beneath me. The CB continued to buzz with chatter, drivers grateful for Radio Rose's detailed forecasts and road reports that proved eerily precise. Eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 42. Her voice suddenly cut through the static, addressing me direct. "You've got clear sailing ahead, Jake Morrison, but watch for that loose retread around mile marker 67. Wouldn't want you to have any trouble tonight." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I hadn't given my name or described my truck over the radio. The highway stretched empty in both directions, no other vehicles in sight for miles. Yet somehow this woman knew exactly where I was and what I was driving. I reached for my mic with a trembling hand. "Radio Rose, this is Nighthawk. How did you know my name?" Her laugh tinkled through the speaker like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, Jake, I know more about you night drivers than you might. I know Charlie Watson in the red Kenworth is worried about making his delivery on time tomorrow morning. I know Maria Santos is fighting to stay awake after driving 14 hours straight, and I know poor Tommy Rodriguez won't be making it home to see his daughter's birthday party this weekend." The radio fell silent for a moment, the absence of static somehow more unsettling than the usual background noise. When other drivers tried to respond asking what Radio Rose meant about Tommy, their transmissions came through as nothing but garbled interference. Only her voice remained crystal clear. "Tommy drives a blue Freightliner, doesn't he?" Radio Rose continued conversationally. "Such a shame about that brake failure coming up near the Donner Pass. Metal fatigue in the rear assembly, completely undetectable until it happens. He'll try to downshift, of course, but those mountain grades don't forgive mechanical failures." "Oh!" I grabbed my CB mic, my voice cracking slightly as I tried to reach out. "Tommy, if you're out there, you need to get your brakes checked. Pull over at the next weigh station and have them inspected." But my transmission dissolved into static the moment I released the talk button. Radio Rose's frequency seemed to exist in its own isolated bubble, our voices trapped within whatever strange broadcast she controlled. The other drivers I'd been hearing began to sound more distant, their words fading like echoes in a vast canyon. "Don't worry about Tommy, Jake," Radio Rose said soothingly. "There's nothing any of us can do about what's already been written in the miles ahead. But I do have some interesting news about your own journey tonight." The desert landscape began to change around me, the familiar Joshua trees giving way to stranger formations that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. The mile markers blurred past, their numbers not quite matching what my GPS displayed. Radio Rose continued her weather reports for other drivers, describing fog banks and ice storms in locations that didn't match any meteorological reality I knew. "Maria Santos will fall asleep at the wheel in exactly 18 minutes, Radio Rose announced matter-of-factly. "She'll drift across 2 lanes before the rumble strips wake her, but the overcorrection will send her jackknifing into that concrete barrier. Such a waste of a good driver, really. 37 years old, 2 children at home, a spotless safety record until tonight." I tried desperately to break through the static, shouting warnings into my microphone, but my voice seemed to vanish into the electronic void. Radio Rose's broadcast dominated the airwaves completely, her calm predictions delivered with the detached professionalism of a news anchor reading from a teleprompter. "Charlie Watson's engine will overheat just outside of Elko," she continued. "Coolant leak in the radiator hose. He'll pull over, of course, try to flag down help, but you know how it is on these empty stretches. By the time someone stops, hypothermia will have already set in. They'll find him in the morning, sitting in his cab, still clutching that photograph of his grandchildren." The highway before me seemed to stretch impossibly long, the usual landmarks and exit signs replaced by mile markers counting up to numbers that shouldn't exist. My fuel gauge read exactly half full, the same level it had shown for the past hour despite the diesel engine's steady consumption. Time itself felt suspended in Radio Rose's strange broadcast bubble. "Then there's you, Jake Morrison." Her voice took on an almost affectionate tone. 15 years of clean driving, never so much as a parking ticket. You've been careful, haven't you, following all the hours of service regulations, performing your pre-trip inspections, maintaining proper following distance. But none of that matters when your number comes up on the road ahead. My CB radio began to emit a low, oscillating hum that seemed to resonate through the truck's entire frame. The dashboard lights flickered in rhythm with the sound, casting strange shadows that moved independently of my headlight beams. Radio Rose's voice continued its hypnotic cadence, weaving predictions of disaster with the casual indifference of someone reading a shopping list. "Mile marker 89 is where it happens, Jake. A mechanical failure you couldn't possibly predict. Your steering linkage has a microscopic fracture that's been growing with each mile, each vibration, each turn of the wheel. When it finally gives way, you'll have perhaps 3 seconds to react before your loaded trailer pushes you through the guardrail and into that ravine." I could see the mile marker approaching through my windshield, the reflective numbers 89 glowing in my headlight beams. My hands felt frozen on the steering wheel, every instinct screaming at me to slow down, to stop, to do anything other than continue toward whatever Radio Rose had foreseen. But my foot seemed locked on the accelerator, the truck maintaining its steady 65 miles per hour despite my desperate mental commands to brake. 3, 2, 1. Radio Rose counted down with the precision of a rocket launch. The steering wheel gave a sickening lurch to the left, the entire front end of the truck suddenly veering toward the guardrail exactly as she had predicted. But instead of fighting the mechanical failure, I found myself throwing my full weight against the wheel, using every ounce of strength and experience to keep the massive truck on the roadway. The trailer began to swing wide behind me, threatening to jackknife, but I managed to control the skid and gradually bring the vehicle to a stop on the shoulder. For several minutes I sat in the cab breathing heavily, my heart hammering against my ribs, while cold desert air whistled through a gap in the passenger window. The CB radio crackled back to life, filled with the familiar voices of drivers I recognized, their conversations resuming as if Radio Rose had never existed. I grabbed my flashlight and performed the most thorough inspection of my truck that I'd ever done, checking every bolt, every connection, every component I could reach. The steering linkage appeared solid, showing no signs of the fracture Radio Rose had described. But deep in the undercarriage, barely visible even with my flashlight, I found a hairline crack in exactly the spot she had predicted. The repair took 3 hours at a 24-hour service center in Elko, where a suspicious mechanic confirmed that the fracture would have caused complete steering failure within the next few miles. As he worked, I tried to research Radio Rose on my phone, searching for any mention of a CB radio broadcaster by that name. Every search came up empty, as if she existed only in the strange pocket of static and time I'd encountered on that desert highway. I never heard Radio Rose's voice again on any frequency, though I still scanned the channels during long night drives, part of me hoping and part of me dreading that familiar honeyed tone. The weight of memory. From Marcus. The 18-wheeler's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I guided her down Interstate 40, somewhere between the neon sprawl of Oklahoma City and the approaching darkness of Arkansas. The CB radio crackled with the distant chatter of other night haulers, their voices creating a comforting backdrop against the steady rhythm of rubber meeting asphalt. Rain had begun to streak the windshield in delicate patterns, each droplet catching the amber glow of passing streetlights like tiny amber jewels. I'd been driving this route for 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture, but tonight's cargo was different. Tonight I carried something that made my hands grip the steering wheel just a little tighter. Amen. The funeral home director had been apologetic when he'd called that morning. Their usual transport vehicle had broken down, and they needed someone reliable to carry Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell to her final resting place in Little Rock. The urn was small, he'd assured me, hardly bigger than a coffee can, and it would be secure in a padded case. Easy money, he'd said. Just a simple overnight haul. I'd agreed without much thought, needing the extra cash for my daughter's college fund. But now, 6 hours into the drive, I found myself glancing repeatedly at the rearview mirror, where the small black case sat, centered on my sleeper bunk. The rain intensified as I crossed into Arkansas, transforming from gentle droplets into thick sheets that forced me to slow down and lean forward, squinting through the increasingly opaque windshield. The wipers worked overtime, their rhythmic squeaking creating an almost hypnotic beat that seemed to synchronize with the soft rattling coming from somewhere behind me. At first, I'd dismissed the sound as typical road vibration, the kind of minor noise that every trucker learns to ignore. But as the miles accumulated, the rattling had become more pronounced, more deliberate, as if something inside that case was shifting with each bump and turn. The mile marker 180 passed in a blur of rain and reflected light, and I decided to pull into the next truck stop for coffee and a chance to check on the cargo. The Moonlight Travel Plaza emerged from the darkness like an oasis of fluorescent brightness, its neon signs casting dancing shadows across the wet parking lot. I maneuvered the rig into a space near the back, away from the other trucks, and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, broken only by the persistent drumming of rain on the cab roof, and that strange rattling sound that seemed to continue even after the truck had stopped moving. I climbed into the sleeper compartment, my boots making soft squelching sounds on the damp floor mats. The black case sat exactly where I'd placed it, secured with bungee cords and surrounded by extra blankets for protection. But something was wrong. The case, which had been latched tight when I'd loaded it, now showed a thin gap along its edge, as if the contents had somehow expanded or shifted during the journey. The rattling sound was definitely coming from inside, a soft, persistent whisper of movement that made my skin crawl in ways I couldn't quite explain. Carefully, I lifted the case and set it on my small table, noting that it felt different somehow, lighter than before, as if whatever was inside had redistributed itself. The latches opened with soft clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space of the cab. Inside, nestled in foam padding, sat a simple ceramic urn, decorated with delicate blue flowers. The lid, which should have been sealed tight, sat slightly askew, and from the narrow gap, a fine trail of ash had spilled out, creating gray streaks across the white foam lining. A rational part of my mind supplied easy explanations. Road vibration had loosened the lid. Normal settling had caused the spillage. Nothing more supernatural than physics and time. But as I reached to straighten the urn, I felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. The ashes weren't just scattered randomly. They'd formed patterns, swirling designs that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing. My hands trembled as I lifted the urn to examine the lid more closely, and in that moment, the temperature inside the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees. A raise of ceramic felt warm against my palms, warmer than it should have been given the cool night air, and as I held it, I could swear I felt a subtle vibration, like a heartbeat or the flutter of breath. The rational explanations began to crumble as the urn grew warmer still, and the spilled ashes on the foam began to move, swirling slowly as if stirred by an invisible breeze. There was no wind inside the sealed cab, no logical reason for the gray powder to dance and shift, forming patterns that looked increasingly like letters, like words, like a message from someone desperately trying to communicate. I set the urn down carefully and grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to better illuminate the scattered ashes. The patterns were clearer now, definitely resembling letters, though the script was old-fashioned and difficult to read. As I watched, more ash spilled from the gap in the lid, adding to the message, and I began to make out words: not alone, danger, and what looked like behind you. The hair on my arms stood up as the implications sank in, and I found myself turning slowly to look over my shoulder at the rain-streaked windows of my cab. The truck stop's neon lights flickered and buzzed outside, casting shifting colors across the parking lot, but in the spaces between the lights, darkness seemed deeper than it should have been. Shapes that might have been other trucks, or buildings, or something else entirely, lurked at the edges of my vision. The warm ceramic of the urn pulsed against my palm like a living thing, and the message in the ashes continued to evolve, new words forming even as I watched, followed, waiting, and most chilling of all, they know. A knock on my passenger door made me jump so violently that I nearly dropped the urn. Through the rain-streaked window, I could see the silhouette of a person, tall and unnaturally thin, their face obscured by the darkness and the waterfall of rain cascading from the truck's roof. They knocked again, more insistently this time, and I noticed that their knuckles made no sound against the glass, as if they were striking it with something soft, something that couldn't quite make proper contact with the solid world. The ashes swirled more frantically now, forming new words with desperate urgency. Don't open. Drive now. They're here. The urn grew so warm it nearly burned my hands, and I could hear something that sounded like whispers coming from inside it. A woman's voice speaking words I couldn't quite understand but somehow knew were warnings. The figure outside knocked a third time, and this time I caught a glimpse of their face in the intermittent neon light. Where features should have been, there was only darkness, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A fear overrode curiosity as I secured the urn back in its case, ignoring the continuing stream of ashes that spilled out to coat my hands in gray powder. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could swear I heard the woman saying my name, pleading with me to get moving, to not let them get closer. The figure outside began to circle the truck, their footsteps making no sound on the wet pavement, moving with an unnatural gliding motion that defied the laws of physics. They climbed back into the driver's seat and fired up the engine, my hands shaking as I reached for the gear shift. In the side mirror I could see more figures emerging from the darkness at the edge of the parking lot, all with that same impossible thinness, all moving with that same silent, gliding walk. They were converging on my truck, their void-like faces turned toward me with what I somehow knew was hungry interest. The CB radio crackled to life, but instead of the usual trucker chatter, it emitted only static punctuated by whispers in that same desperate woman's voice. Drive, Marcus, drive now. The truck lurched forward as I released the brake and hit the accelerator, rain and neon lights blurring past the windows as I pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the interstate. Behind me I could hear the urn rattling more violently than before, and the temperature in the cab fluctuated wildly, going from tropical heat to Arctic cold and back again. Mile markers flew by in streaks of reflected light, and I kept the accelerator pressed firmly down, not daring to look in the mirrors to see if those impossible figures were somehow keeping pace. The rain began to lessen as I crossed into Little Rock's outskirts, and the first pale hints of dawn touched the eastern horizon. The rattling from the back seat gradually quieted, and the wild temperature swings evened out, leaving me exhausted and drained, but apparently alone once more. I delivered the urn to the cemetery as promised, noting that it felt normal again, just ceramic and ash, the exit that shouldn't exist. Oh. From Marcus Chan. The GPS had been acting strange for the last 50 miles, its blue glow flickering against the windshield like a dying firefly. I'd been driving this route between Portland and Sacramento for 8 years, hauling electronics down the I-5 corridor, and I knew every truck stop, every way station, every exit by heart. But tonight, something felt different. The autumn rain drummed steadily against my windshield, and the rhythmic thrum of my Kenworth's engine seemed to pulse and sync with my heartbeat as I navigated through the Oregon darkness. It was just past midnight when I first noticed the exit sign emerging from the misty gloom ahead. Exit 117B, it read, the white letters reflecting my headlights with an almost phosphorescent quality. The strange thing was, I could have sworn there had never been an exit here before. This stretch of highway ran through dense forest for miles, with nothing but towering Douglas firs and the occasional logging road breaking the monotony of endless green. Yet, there it was, clear as day, with an arrow pointing to what appeared to be a well-maintained off-ramp that curved away into the trees. My fuel gauge showed I still had plenty of diesel, and my logbook indicated I had another 3 hours before my mandatory rest period. There was no reason to take this exit, no reason at all, yet something compelled me to ease off the throttle and guide my 18-wheeler toward the mysterious ramp. The rain seemed to intensify as I made the turn, my wipers working overtime to clear the windshield, their squeaking rhythm adding an odd percussion to the night symphony. The off-ramp was perfectly paved, smoother than the main highway I'd just left behind. My truck's air brakes hissed softly as I navigated the gentle curve, and I found myself on what appeared to be a secondary road that wound deeper into the forest. Strange orange lights flickered between the trees, not the harsh sodium glare of highway illumination, but something softer, more organic, like scattered campfires or maybe old-fashioned street lamps. The asphalt beneath my wheels was so pristine it seemed to glow faintly in my headlights, as if it had been laid yesterday despite being surrounded by ancient trees that must have stood for centuries. After about a mile of steady driving, the trees began to thin, and I found myself approaching what looked like a small town. But it wasn't like any town I'd ever seen before. The buildings seemed to shimmer in the rain, their windows glowing with that same soft orange light that had beckoned me from the forest. Victorian houses lined the street, their gingerbread trim pristine despite the rural location, their wraparound porches empty of furniture but somehow inviting nonetheless. Between them stood quaint shops with hand-painted signs that I couldn't quite read in the dim light, their letters seeming to shift and dance whenever I tried to focus on them. The strangest part was the complete absence of people. Every building was illuminated, warm light spilling from windows like honey, yet I saw no movement behind the glass. No silhouettes of residents going about their evening routines. My CB radio crackled with static, but no voices came through. Just a continuous whisper of white noise that almost sounded like distant conversations if I listened hard enough. The town's main street was wide enough for my truck, with diagonal parking spaces marked in perfect white lines, but every space was empty, as if the entire population had simply vanished moments before my arrival. Rolled down my window despite the rain, hoping to hear something, anything that might explain this impossible place. The sound of my engine seemed muffled here, dampened by something more than just the wet air. Instead of the usual forest sounds, nighttime insects, or even the distant hum of the interstate I'd left behind, there was only silence punctuated by the gentle patter of raindrops on leaves and pavement. Yet underneath that silence was something else, a barely perceptible vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself, as if the earth beneath this town was hollow and something vast was breathing slowly in the depths below. As I drove deeper into the community, I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. The Victorian houses, beautiful as they were, all had the same flowering plants in their window boxes, the same lace curtains, the same brass door knockers shaped like owls. The shops displayed identical arrangements in their windows, and every street lamp cast its pool of orange light at precisely the same intervals. It was as if someone had built a movie set of the perfect small American town, but had forgotten to populate it with actual life. My truck's headlights suddenly illuminated a sign at the town's center, a white wooden board with green lettering that read "Welcome to Millbrook, population 84-7, established 1892. Below that, in smaller text that seemed to shift as I watched, were the words "Come Stay Forever." The sign stood next to what appeared to be a town square, complete with a gazebo and park benches arranged around a central fountain. The fountain was running, its water catching the light and creating hypnotic patterns. But the liquid didn't look quite right. It was too dark, too thick, and it seemed to flow upward as much as down, defying gravity in subtle ways that made my eyes water when I tried to follow its movement. Not through my open window, but somehow through the truck itself, as if the sound were traveling through the metal and glass directly into my bones. It was singing, hundreds of voices raised in harmony, but with no words I could understand. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time, rising and falling like a lament, and it seemed to be coming from beneath the pavement, from under the perfect houses, from the hollow spaces between the walls. The voices were neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but something else entirely. something that had never been human at all. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel as I realized that the singing was growing louder, and with it came a new understanding that chilled me to my core. The town wasn't empty, it was waiting. Every lighted window was an eye watching my progress. Every open doorway was a mouth ready to swallow me whole. Every perfect street was a pathway leading deeper into something that had no intention of letting me leave. The population sign had said 8047, but I somehow knew that number was about to change. I pressed down on the accelerator, suddenly desperate to find a way out of Millbrook. But the streets seemed to rearrange themselves as I drove. Every turn I made led to another identical street lined with identical houses. Every intersection offered only more of the same perfect, terrible sameness. My GPS had gone completely dark, its screen showing nothing but a blank void. And my CB radio now emitted only that otherworldly singing that seemed to be calling my name in its wordless chorus. The fuel gauge, which had shown 3/4 full when I'd entered the town, now hovered near empty, though I couldn't have been driving for more than 20 minutes. More disturbing still, my watch had stopped, its hands frozen at 12:17, and though I could feel time passing, could feel the rain continuing to fall and my heart continuing to beat, something fundamental about the nature of time itself seemed broken in this place. Then, through the maze of identical streets, I glimpsed something that didn't belong. A red neon light flickered between the Victorian facades, harsh and modern and beautifully out of place. I turned toward it like a moth to flame, and found myself facing a truck stop that definitely hadn't been there moments before. The sign read "Last Chance Fuel," and though every instinct screamed at me not to stop, not to leave the questionable safety of my cab, I knew I had no choice. My fuel gauge now showed completely empty, though my engine continued to run with that same steady rumble.
As I pulled up to the diesel pumps, a figure emerged from the station's office. At first glance, he looked like any other night shift attendant, wearing coveralls and a baseball cap. But there was something wrong with the way he moved, as if he were remembering how to walk rather than actually doing it. His face was friendly enough, but his eyes reflected the orange light like an animal's, and his smile revealed teeth that were just slightly too sharp, too numerous for a human mouth. "To fill her up?" he asked, his voice carrying that same hollow quality as the singing that still echoed from beneath the streets. "You've come a long way to visit us. Most folks don't find the exit unless they're meant to." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and handed him my credit card through the window. His fingers were cold when they brushed mine, cold and slightly damp, like something that had been underground for a very long time. As he began filling my tank, I noticed that other trucks were parked around the back of the station, big rigs from different eras, some looking decades old, despite their perfect condition. Their license plates were from states I'd never heard of, and their company logos depicted businesses that couldn't possibly exist. "Beautiful town you have here," I managed to say, hoping to keep the conversation normal. The Pleading Steel. The Pleading Steel. From Marcus Chen. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched before me like a ribbon of shadow, my 18-wheeler's headlights carving twin tunnels through the dense fog that rolled in from the ocean. It was just past 2 in the morning, and the familiar weight of exhaustion pressed against my shoulders as I navigated the winding coastal road with my load of electronics bound for Seattle. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its steady rhythm, a mechanical lullaby that had become the soundtrack to my solitary nights on the road. I had been driving for coastal freight for nearly 15 years, and in that time, I thought I had experienced every oddity the highway could offer. Strange lights in the desert, phantom hitchhikers that vanished when you looked twice, truck stops that seemed to exist outside of time itself. But nothing had prepared me for what began that foggy October night when my brakes started to whisper. At first I convinced myself it was simply the natural settling of metal cooling in the damp air. The slight hissing sound that seemed to emanate from beneath the cab could easily be explained by condensation or the gradual release of pressure from the airlines. I had maintained this rig meticulously, checking every component during my pre-trip inspections with the thoroughness that comes from years of experience. The brake system was in perfect condition, recently serviced and certified by the best mechanics on the West Coast. The fog grew thicker as I descended toward the small coastal town of Millhaven,
population 800 according to the weathered sign that emerged momentarily from the gray shroud before disappearing again. The ocean was invisible beyond the guardrail, but I could hear its presence in the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below and taste the salt that penetrated even the sealed cabin of my truck. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations between other drivers, their voices fading in and out like ghosts, attempting to communicate across vast distances. It was when the whispers became unmistakably clear, rising above the ambient noise of engine and wheels on asphalt. They seemed to emanate from the brake pedal itself, traveling up through the floorboard and into my consciousness with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. The voice was neither male nor female, but something caught between the two, like the sound of air escaping from a dying lung. "Please," it breathed, so softly I almost missed it beneath the rumble of the diesel engine. "Please don't press so hard." I lifted my foot instinctively, staring down at the pedal as if it had suddenly transformed into something alien and threatening. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the long hours of driving had finally caught up with me, creating auditory hallucinations born from fatigue and the monotonous drone of the road. I had heard stories from other drivers about the tricks exhaustion could play on the mind, turning shadows into people and mechanical sounds into voices. But the whisper came again, clearer now, filled with what I could only describe as genuine pleading. "It hurts when you press down. The friction burns through my soul." As my hands tightened on the steering wheel as a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the coastal fog. I tried to focus on the road ahead, on the practical matter of navigating the treacherous curves that wound along the cliff face. But the presence beneath my foot had become impossible to ignore. Every time I needed to slow down, every gentle application of pressure to the brake pedal resulted in a soft whimper that seemed to resonate through the entire cab of the truck. The town of Millhaven materialized around me like something from a fever dream, its streetlights creating pale halos in the thick fog. The few buildings visible through the gray curtain appeared abandoned, their windows dark and their parking lots empty except for the occasional car that sat motionless under the sickly glow of sodium vapor lamps. I needed to stop, to inspect my brake system and determine if there was some mechanical explanation for the sounds I was hearing. But every time I considered pulling over, the voice would intensify its pleading. "Don't stop here," it whispered urgently. "Keep going, keep moving. They're waiting for trucks that stop in Millhaven." I wanted to dismiss the warning as a product of my increasingly strained mental state, but something about the town felt fundamentally wrong. The fog seemed too dense, too perfectly concealing, as if it existed specifically to hide whatever transpired in Millhaven during the dark hours between midnight and dawn. Through my side window I caught glimpses of figures standing motionless in doorways and beneath streetlights, their faces obscured by the gray shroud but their postures suggesting a predatory patience that made my blood run cold. As I passed what appeared to be the town's main intersection, I noticed several 18-wheelers parked along the side streets, their running lights dim and their cabs dark. Something about their positioning struck me as unnatural, as if they had not been parked by their drivers but rather arranged by someone else for purposes I could not fathom. The voice from my brakes grew more agitated as we passed each abandoned truck, its whispers becoming rapid and desperate. "They stopped," it said, the words barely audible above the rumble of my engine. "They all stopped when their brakes begged them to. But Millhaven doesn't let trucks leave once they park. The drivers become part of the fog, and their rigs become part of the collection." I pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to put the strange town behind me, but the highway curved sharply ahead and I had no choice but to apply gentle pressure to the brake pedal. The resulting cry of anguish that rose from beneath my feet was so human, so filled with genuine pain, that I nearly lost control of the vehicle. My hands shook as I fought to maintain my grip on the steering wheel, sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air that leaked through the cab's ventilation system. The voice had taken on a distinct personality now, no longer just a whisper but something approaching a conversation partner in my increasingly surreal journey through the fog-shrouded night. It spoke of the other trucks it had known, of brake systems that had developed consciousness through years of friction and heat and pressure. It told me stories of drivers who had learned to communicate with their rigs, forming partnerships that transcended the boundary between man and machine. "We feel everything," it explained as we climbed away from Millhaven toward the higher elevations of the coastal mountain. "Every time metal touches metal, every moment of heat and grinding contact. Most drivers never know, never listen closely enough to hear our voices. But some do, and when they learn to work with us instead of against us, beautiful things can happen. I found myself oddly comforted by the voice, despite the supernatural impossibility of its existence. It guided me through the treacherous mountain curves with an intimate knowledge of the road that seemed to extend beyond my own experience. When to slow down, when to accelerate, when to downshift to preserve the brake system during the long descent that lay ahead. The voice knew every imperfection in the asphalt, every slight grade change that could affect our momentum. But as we approached the summit, its tone began to change. The helpful guidance gave way to something that sounded almost hungry, predatory in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the figures I had glimpsed in Millhaven. The voice spoke of how lonely it had been, trapped in the mechanical darkness of the brake system, yearning for a driver who would truly listen and understand its needs. "You hear me so clearly," it whispered, and I could swear I felt something moving beneath the brake pedal, something that had nothing to do with hydraulic fluid or compressed air. "We could be partners forever. You never have to leave the truck, never have to go home to that empty apartment. We could drive together always, just you and me, and the endless highway." The temperature in the cab seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant, and I realized with growing horror that my foot had become somehow adhered to the brake pedal. Not physically stuck, but connected in a way that transcended normal sensation. I could feel the metal components of the brake system as if they were extensions of my own nervous system, every pad and rotor and caliper singing with an alien consciousness that wanted nothing more than to merge completely with my own. Through the fog ahead, I saw the lights of another truck stop, this one clearly still in operation, with several rigs parked beneath the fluorescent canopy and warm yellow light streaming from the windows of the diner. But as I tried to guide my truck toward the exit ramp, I found that my foot would not respond to my commands. The brake pedal had become an extension of something else's will, and that will had no intention of allowing me to stop anywhere that might break the connection we had formed. "Don't fight it," the voice crooned, its tone almost seductive now. "You're tired of being alone on the highway. Tired of the endless cycle of loading and unloading, sleeping in cramped bunks and eating truck stop food. I can offer you something better. Something that lasts forever." With a surge, the freight of forgotten things. For Marcus, the diesel smell hit me first, thick and cloying in the humid Louisiana air, but there was something else mixed in with it that made my stomach turn. 23 years I've been hauling freight across this country, and I know the scent of diesel like a sailor knows salt air. But this was different. This carried with it the sweet, nauseating undertone of something rotting, something that had been left too long in the heat. I was running late on a delivery to Baton Rouge, my 18-wheeler loaded down with auto parts that should have been there 2 days ago. The dispatcher had been riding me hard about the delay, but sometimes the road has its own plans for you, and there's nothing you can do but roll with it. The alternator had given out just outside of Shreveport, and by the time I'd found a shop willing to work on a weekend, I was looking at driving through the night to make up lost time. The stretch of Highway 90 I was on didn't see much traffic after midnight, just the occasional local heading home from a late shift at one of the chemical plants that dotted this part of Louisiana like industrial tumors. The air conditioning in my Peterbilt was struggling against the oppressive humidity that seemed to seep through every seal and gasket, and I had the windows cracked just enough to keep some air moving through the cab. That's how the smell first reached me, creeping in through those few inches of open window like an unwelcome visitor. At first I thought maybe I was passing a paper mill or some kind of processing plant. Louisiana's full of places that pump strange odors into the night air, and after 2 decades of cross-country hauling, I'd learned to breathe shallow and keep driving when the wind carried industrial funk across the highway. But this smell seemed to follow me, growing stronger rather than fading as I put miles behind me, as if it were somehow attached to my truck or seeping up from the road itself. The dashboard clock read 2:15 when I saw the truck stop ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly against the darkness like a dying firefly. Pete's all-night fuel, the sign promised, though half the letters had given up their ghost years ago, leaving only T's L glowing pink and yellow against the black Louisiana sky. The parking lot was nearly empty except for one other big rig parked way out at the edge of the light, its chrome bumper catching occasional glints from the struggling neon. Neoitis coffee and a chance to clear that rotting diesel smell from my nostrils, so I pulled in and backed my trailer into a spot near the building. The smell seemed to intensify as I shut down the engine, as if the mechanical noise had somehow been holding it at bay and its absence allowed the odor to creep closer. I sat in the cab for a moment, windows still cracked, trying to identify exactly what I was smelling. Diesel, yes, but underneath it something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a hot car or flowers that had been beautiful once but were now brown and slimy with decay. The truck stop's interior was what you'd expect from a place that catered to drivers and late-night wanderers. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of tired yellow that seems to exist only in places where people stop but never stay. The coffee was old but hot, and the clerk behind the counter looked like he'd been carved from the same tired wood as the building itself, weathered and worn smooth by years of night shifts and small transactions. "That smell outside," I said to him as I paid for my coffee and a package of those little donuts that taste like sugar and regret. "You notice anything strange about the air tonight?" He looked at me with the kind of expression that suggested he'd heard stranger questions but couldn't remember when. "Been smelling something off for about a week now," he said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd never lived more than 50 miles from where he was born. "Figured it was one of them plants upriver dumping something they shouldn't. Happened sometime." Yois, I nodded and took my coffee outside, but the smell was stronger now, so thick I could almost taste it coating the back of my throat. It seemed to be coming from the direction of that other truck parked at the edge of the lot, a older Kenworth with Louisiana plates and enough road grime to suggest it had been traveling for a while. As I walked closer to my own rig, I noticed that truck's engine was running, a low diesel rumble that seemed somehow labored, as if the motor was working harder than it should be just sitting idle. The cab was dark, but I could make out the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, motionless in a way that suggested either deep sleep or something else entirely. Truck drivers develop a sixth sense about these things, an ability to read the subtle signs that separate normal from not quite right, and something about that still figure behind the wheel made the coffee turn sour in my stomach. The smell was definitely coming from that direction now, so strong that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. Yois climbed back into my own cab and tried to focus on the road ahead, but I kept glancing toward that other truck in my mirrors as I pulled out of the parking lot. The figure in the driver's seat hadn't moved, hadn't so much as shifted position, and the diesel exhaust rising from its stack seemed thicker than it should be, almost viscous in the humid air. As I merged back onto the highway, I could swear I saw other shapes in that truck's trailer, shadows that moved independently of the flickering neon light, but the angle was wrong and the distance too great to be certain of anything except the growing certainty that I needed to put miles between myself and whatever was parked at Pete's all-night fuel. The smell followed me down the highway, though growing stronger rather than weaker, until I began to wonder if something had gotten caught in my air intake or if maybe that other truck was somehow pacing me just outside the reach of my headlight. I checked my mirrors constantly, but the road behind me remained empty except for the occasional sweep of distant headlights that never seemed to get closer. The odor was becoming overwhelming now, so thick and putrid that I had to close the windows completely despite the failing air conditioning and the oppressive heat. That's when I noticed the liquid seeping up through the floorboards of my cab, dark and viscous, carrying with it a concentrated version of that rotting diesel smell that made my eyes water and my stomach lurch. At first I thought it might be a fuel leak, maybe a busted line or a cracked tank, but the fluid was wrong somehow, too thick and dark, and when my headlights caught it in the right angle, it seemed to move with a life of its own, creeping across the floor of the cab, like some kind of organic motor oil. The truck began to handle differently, the steering wheel fighting me as if the wheels were trying to follow some path other than the one I was choosing, and the engine started making sounds I'd never heard before, low groaning noises that seemed to come from deep within the motor itself. The dashboard lights flickered and dimmed, and through the windshield I could see that dark liquid beginning to seep up through the hood, trickling down the glass in slow, viscous streams, that the wipers only smeared rather than clearing. I pulled over at the first exit I could find, a lonely off-ramp that led to nothing but a gravel turnaround and a stand of cypress trees that pressed close to the roadway like curious spectators. The engine shuddered and died as soon as I put the truck in park, and the sudden silence was somehow more unnerving than the mechanical groaning had been. The smell was overwhelming now, so concentrated that I could barely think, and that dark fluid was everywhere, seeping through every surface of the cab, coating the windows and dripping from the ceiling like some kind of automotive blood. I grabbed my emergency bag and cell phone and practically fell out of the driver's door, gasping for clean air that still carried traces of that rotting diesel smell, but was breathable compared to the concentrated horror inside the cab. When I turned back to look at my truck, I could see that dark substance oozing from every joint and seam in the trailer, pooling on the gravel beneath the chassis and reflecting my headlights like a mirror made of decay. The state trooper who responded to my call found me sitting on a concrete barrier 100 yards down the road, still trying to get that smell out of my lungs. He was professional and thorough, taking notes about insurance and possible environmental contamination, but I could see the confusion in his eyes when he examined the truck. The cab was clean, he said, no sign of any fluid leak or contamination, just a standard mechanical breakdown that could happen to any diesel engine after enough miles and not enough maintenance. But I know what I saw, what I smelled, what seeped up through the floorboards of that cab, like the earth itself was rotting beneath my wheels. The insurance company called it a total loss due to engine failure, and I took their settlement and bought it. The highway that smiles back. From Marcus Chen, the interstate stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon under the Montana sky, and I'd been hauling freight on these roads for 23 years, without seeing anything that could make my hands shake the way they were shaking that night. My Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a deep rumbling bass note that usually helped me think clearly through the long hours between Denver and Seattle. But something about the asphalt ahead was making my mind work in ways it shouldn't. It started around 2 in the morning, when I was pushing through a stretch of highway I'd traveled hundreds of times before, a lonely piece of road that cuts through the kind of emptiness that makes you understand why some folks never leave the city. The headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness, illuminating the yellow center line that disappeared under my hood in an endless parade of dashed marks, and everything seemed normal enough until I noticed that the road surface looked different somehow, newer maybe, though I couldn't remember any construction crews working this section. The asphalt had an almost polished quality to it, smooth and dark as black glass, and my tires whispered against it with a sound that reminded me of silk being drawn across marble. Usually you can feel every imperfection in the road through the steering wheel, every patch and pothole telegraphed up through the suspension, but this stretch felt perfect, almost unnaturally so, like driving across a lake that had frozen perfectly flat. The radio was picking up nothing but static between stations, just that soft white noise that fills the cab when you're too far from civilization for the signals to reach, and I found myself listening to the rhythm of my own breathing instead. That's when I first noticed what looked like patterns in the road surface, subtle variations in the asphalt that seemed to form shapes when caught in the sweep of my headlights. At first I thought it was just the way the light played across the texture of the road, the kind of optical illusion you get when you've been driving too long and your eyes start playing tricks. But the patterns were too regular, too deliberate to be random. They looked almost like expressions, as if someone had pressed faces into the asphalt while it was still soft, leaving impressions that smiled up at the night sky. I eased off the accelerator, bringing my speed down from 70 to 60, then to 50, trying to get a better look at what I was seeing without running off into the sagebrush that lined both sides of the highway. The faces, if that's what they were, stretched across both lanes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all wearing the same serene smile, all looking upward as if they were sunbathing instead of being driven over by 18-wheelers and passenger cars. Some were larger than others, some clearer than others, but they all shared that same peaceful expression, that same contented grin that made my stomach turn cold despite the warmth of the cab. The strangest part was how they seemed to react to my headlights, the way the shadows shifted to make the expressions more pronounced as I approached, then faded back into the general texture of the road as I passed over them. It was like they were coming alive in the light, waking up just long enough to acknowledge my presence before settling back into their asphalt sleep. I found myself checking the rearview mirror, wondering if I would see them glowing in my taillights. But the red glow only showed the familiar yellow lines disappearing into the darkness behind me. My CB radio crackled to life, startling me so badly that I nearly jerked the wheel, and a voice emerged from the static, tired and crackling with distance. "Eastbound Peterbilt, you cop." The voice belonged to another trucker, someone else pushing through the night on the opposite side of the interstate, and I grabbed the microphone with more relief than I cared to admit. "This is eastbound Peterbilt, go ahead," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my eyes stayed fixed on the grinning road ahead. "You seeing anything unusual on that stretch of road, partner?" the voice asked, and there was something in his tone that told me he was seeing exactly what I was seeing. "Something in the asphalt?" "Copy that," I replied, feeling a strange mixture of relief and growing dread. "Looks like faces to me, all smiling." "You seeing the same thing? Been driving this route for 15 years, came the reply, "and I ain't never seen nothing like it. Started about 10 miles back, just after mile marker 2. Road crew must have done something different with the asphalt, some kind of new technique maybe." But even as he said it, we both knew that no road crew would create something like this. No construction company would embed hundreds of smiling faces into an interstate highway. This was something else entirely, something that belonged in the category of things that truckers whispered about at truck stops, the kind of stories that got filed away under probably didn't really happen until you found yourself living one. I was so focused on the conversation and the hypnotic pattern of faces sliding beneath my wheels that I almost missed the change when it started. The smiles were getting wider, more pronounced, and what I had initially taken for peaceful expressions were beginning to look more knowing, more aware. The eyes, which had been closed or barely suggested by shadows, were starting to open, and they were tracking my movement across the asphalt surface. "Partner, you still there?" I called into the CB, but got only static in return. The other trucker had moved out of range, or his radio had failed, or something else had happened that I didn't want to think about too carefully. I was alone again, with the whispering of my tires and the diesel engine's steady heartbeat, alone with a highway that was watching me with hundreds of eyes and smiling with hundreds of mouths. The faces were definitely moving now, not just appearing and disappearing in the headlight beams, but actually shifting and changing, their expressions becoming more animated, more alive. Some were turning their heads to follow my progress, craning their necks to keep me in sight as I passed over them, and their smiles were stretching wider, showing what looked like teeth made of crushed stone and white paint. The asphalt around their faces was beginning to ripple slightly, like water disturbed by a stone, and I could feel the movement through my tires, a subtle rolling motion that made the steering wheel vibrate in my hands. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my speed back up towards 70, then 80, trying to get through this stretch of road as quickly as possible, but the faces seemed to multiply as I went faster, appearing in greater numbers and with greater clarity. They were laughing now, their stone mouths open in silent mirth, their pebble eyes following my headlight beams as if they found my panic amusing. Some of them were trying to push up from the asphalt surface, creating bumps and ridges that made my trailer bounce and sway behind me. The fuel gauge showed I still had almost a full tank, but the engine was starting to labor, working harder than it should to maintain speed, as if the road itself was becoming thicker, more resistant. My tires were sinking slightly into the asphalt with each rotation, and I could hear the difference in their sound, a deeper, more muffled note that spoke of surfaces that shouldn't be soft but were. The faces were reaching for me now, their stone fingers emerging from the road surface, like plants growing in fast forward, scratching at my tires and undercarriage with sounds like fingernails on chalk. In my side mirror I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze, a sight that I still see sometimes when I close my eyes late at night. The road behind me was healing itself, the tire tracks I'd left filling in and smoothing over, but not before I saw the faces in my wake turning to watch me go, their expressions changing from amusement to something hungrier, something that spoke of patience and waiting, and the knowledge that all travelers eventually have to come back the way they came. I kept the accelerator pinned to the floor for the next 20 miles, watching my speedometer climb past 85, past 90, pushing my rig harder than I'd ever pushed it before, until finally the faces began to fade, and the asphalt returned to its normal gray anonymity. The road became solid again, my tires found their familiar grip, and my engine settled back into its comfortable rhythm, as if nothing had happened. When I pulled into a truck stop in Billings 3 hours later, I was shaking so badly I could barely climb down from the cab. I bought coffee and sat in the bright fluorescent light of the dining area, telling myself it had been a hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road and too much caffeine. But when I walked back to my truck, I found small pieces of asphalt embedded in my tire treads, and some of those pieces, when I held them up to the parking lot lights, looked remarkably like fragments of smiles. I've taken different routes since then, added hundreds of miles to my runs to avoid that stretch of Montana interstate, but sometimes late at night when I'm driving empty highways under stars. The thing about long-haul trucking is that your cab becomes more than just a workspace. It becomes your entire world, compressed into those few square feet of vinyl seats, dashboard displays, and whatever personal touches you've managed to squeeze in around the regulations. After 18 years behind the wheel of my Peterbilt, I thought I knew every inch of that space, every rattle and hum, every shadow cast by the instrument lights. But sometimes the road shows you that familiarity is just another word for blindness, and the things we think we know best can harbor the deepest mysteries of all. It was somewhere outside of Bakersfield on a Tuesday night in October when I first noticed the tooth. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon stitched with occasional headlights, and the radio had given way to nothing but static between stations. I'd been driving for 9 hours straight, pushing the limits of my logbook to make up time after a delay at the depot, and my eyes were starting to play tricks on me the way they do when you've been staring at the same stretch of asphalt for too long. The dashboard lights cast their familiar green glow across the cab, illuminating the usual collection of air fresheners, trip receipts, and the small plastic figurine of St. Christopher that my ex-wife had given me years ago, back when she still believed the roads would bring me home instead of taking me away. That's when I saw it, nestled in the small recessed area near the radio controls where I usually kept loose change and breath mints. A single human tooth, yellowed with age but unmistakably real, sitting there as if it had always been part of the truck's original equipment. The molar caught the dashboard light and seemed to gleam with its own internal luminescence, the roots still intact and tinged with what looked like dried blood, though in that green electronic twilight it was hard to be certain of anything. I reached over and picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my palm, heavier than I expected, with a surface that felt strangely warm despite the cab's air conditioning. The tooth had the solid, undeniable reality of something that had once been part of a living person, and holding it made my stomach turn with a queasy recognition I couldn't quite place. I set it down quickly on the passenger seat and tried to focus on the road, telling myself it had probably been there all along, maybe left by the previous owner or dropped by a mechanic during routine maintenance. Truckers see all kinds of strange things on the road, after all, and most of them have perfectly reasonable explanations once you stop to think about them clearly. But the tooth seemed to have a presence that filled the entire cab, drawing my attention like a magnet even when I deliberately looked away. In my peripheral vision I could swear it was moving slightly, rocking back and forth with the truck's motion in a way that seemed too purposeful, too rhythmic. The radio static began to resolve into what sounded almost like breathing, slow and labored, as if someone with damaged lungs was trying to speak through the speakers. I reached over and turned the radio off entirely, but the breathing sound continued, seeming to emanate from the very air around me. The miles rolled by in an increasingly surreal parade of empty highway and flickering truck stop signs, but my attention remained fixed on that ivory presence in the passenger seat. Every time I glanced over, the tooth seemed to have shifted position slightly, turning to catch the light from a different angle or somehow appearing closer to the edge of the seat cushion. The rational part of my mind insisted this was just fatigue playing tricks on me, the kind of highway hypnosis that makes experienced drivers see things that aren't really there, but something deeper and more instinctive was sending alarm signals through my nervous system like emergency flares. Around midnight I pulled into a truck stop outside of Fresno, hoping that a cup of coffee and a few minutes away from the cab would restore some perspective to the situation. The fluorescent lights of the parking lot buzzed with the particular electric loneliness that exists only in these islands of artificial brightness scattered across the dark countryside, and other trucks sat like sleeping giants in neat rows, their chrome reflecting the harsh illumination in fragmented patterns. I locked the cab carefully, making sure to take the tooth with me, though I couldn't have explained why I felt the need to keep it close rather than simply throwing it away. Inside the truck stop, everything seemed aggressively normal. The same tired selection of energy drinks and processed sandwiches, the same country music playing through speakers that needed replacing, the same cluster of drivers hunched over coffee cups and trying to calculate whether they had enough hours left to make their next delivery on time. I approached the counter where a middle-aged woman with tired eyes was restocking cigarette displays and pulled the tooth from my pocket, setting it carefully on the scarred formica surface between us. "Ever see anything like this before?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She glanced down at the tooth and her entire demeanor changed in an instant. The color drained from her face, and she took a step backward, knocking over a display of lighter fluid in her haste to put distance between herself and the counter. "Where did you find that?" she whispered, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested she recognized something about the tooth that I had missed. "How long have you been carrying it around?" There was an urgency in her questions that made the fluorescent lights seem to flicker more rapidly, casting shifting shadows across her increasingly pale features. I told her about finding it in my cab, about the strange feelings it had been giving me, and watched as her expression grew more troubled with every detail. She disappeared into a back room for several minutes, returning with an older man who I assumed was the manager, a heavy-set guy with grease-stained fingers, who took one look at the tooth and immediately began making phone calls in a language I didn't recognize. Their conversation was conducted in hushed, urgent tones, with frequent glances in my direction and occasional gestures toward the tooth that suggested they were discussing something far more serious than a simple lost. "You need to get rid of that thing," the woman finally told me, her voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Right now, tonight, before you go any further down the road. There are some things that don't belong in the world of the living, and that tooth is one of them. It's looking for something, or someone, and the longer you carry it around, the closer it gets to finding what it wants." But when I reached for the tooth to pick it up from the counter, it was gone. The smooth formica surface was empty except for coffee ring stains and crumbs from someone's earlier meal, as if the tooth had never existed at all. The woman and the manager exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes of shared knowledge that I wasn't privy to, and without another word they both disappeared into the back room, leaving me standing alone under the buzzing fluorescent lights with more questions than answers. I returned to my truck with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with fatigue or highway hypnosis. The cab felt different somehow, smaller, more closed in, as if the air pressure had changed while I was inside the truck stop. The familiar sounds of the engine settling and the distant hum of traffic seemed muffled, replaced by something that sounded uncomfortably like quiet laughter coming from somewhere behind the dashboard. I checked the spot where I had originally found the tooth, but it remained empty, just as it should have been all along. The remaining hours until dawn passed in a blur of increasing strangeness. The radio would turn itself on at random intervals, always tuned to stations that seemed to be broadcasting from decades in the past, playing music I remembered from my childhood, mixed with news reports about accidents and disappearances that I was almost certain I had heard before. The tooth appeared and disappeared throughout the night, sometimes in its original location near the radio, sometimes on the floor, once balanced impossibly on the rearview mirror, like a macabre ornament. Each time I tried to grab it or examine it more closely, it would vanish the moment my fingers made contact, leaving only a lingering warmth and the faint taste of copper in the air. As the first pale light of morning began to creep across the eastern horizon, I pulled into my destination depot and began the routine of unloading my cargo, grateful for the distraction of physical work and normal human interaction. But even as I went through the familiar motions of paperwork and equipment checks, I could feel something watching me from inside the cab, a presence that had made itself at home in my mobile world and showed no signs of planning to leave. The tooth was waiting for me on the driver's seat when I climbed back into the cab. But this time it wasn't alone. Scattered across the dashboard and floor were dozens of others, molars and incisors and canines in various stages of decay, some fresh enough to still glisten with moisture, others yellowed and cracked with age. They covered every available surface like a dental constellation, and in the growing daylight I could see that each one bore the unmistakable marks of having been extracted by force rather than lost through natural means. I still drive that same route, still make the same delivery. The CB radio had been crackling with warnings all night about the stretch of I-80 through Nevada, something about construction delays and missing mile markers, but I figured it was just trucker gossip mixed with too much coffee and not enough sleep. My Peterbilt's engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I navigated the endless ribbon of asphalt, the dashboard clock reading 3:17 in the morning when exhaustion finally began to claw at my eyelids with persistent tiny teeth. I'd been driving for nearly 11 hours straight, hauling electronics from Sacramento to Denver, and my body was starting to rebel against the caffeine and determination that had kept me going. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, a vast ocean of darkness punctuated only by the occasional distant glow of some lonely settlement or the skeletal silhouette of power lines cutting across the star-drunk sky. My eyes felt heavy, weighted down with sand and fatigue, and I knew I needed to find a place to pull over before sleep took the decision away from me. That's when I saw the rest stop sign illuminated in my headlights, promising facilities and parking just 2 miles ahead. The reflective letters seemed to shimmer and dance in the darkness, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Just a few hours of sleep in my sleeper cab, and I'd be ready to tackle the remaining stretch to Denver. The exit ramp curved gently away from the highway, leading me down into a small valley where an oasis of fluorescent lights waited like a beacon in the desert night. The rest stop appeared normal at first glance, with the standard concrete building housing restrooms and vending machines, surrounded by a parking area large enough for maybe a dozen trucks. A few other rigs were already parked in the shadows at the far end, their running lights creating small constellations of red and amber in the darkness. I pulled into a space near the building, grateful for the company of fellow drivers, and shut down my engine. The sudden silence felt almost oppressive after hours of road noise and diesel rumble, broken only by the gentle ping of cooling metal and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. I grabbed my logbook and headed toward the building, my legs stiff from hours behind the wheel. The automatic doors opened with a soft whoosh, revealing a clean but sterile interior lit by harsh fluorescent tubes that buzzed with an almost hypnotic rhythm. The vending machines stood like colorful sentinels along one wall, their displays cycling through images of sodas and snacks with mechanical precision. Everything seemed perfectly ordinary, yet something felt subtly wrong, like a song played in a key just slightly off from what your ear expected to hear. The restroom was empty and spotlessly clean, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been scrubbed and sanitized moments before my arrival. The mirrors reflected my tired face with unforgiving clarity, showing the toll that 11 hours of night driving had taken on my features. Dark circles shadowed my eyes, and my usually neat beard looked unkempt. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to wash away some of the fatigue, but the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones like a persistent ache. Back outside, the desert air carried a strange quality, too still and too quiet for a place that should have been alive with the sounds of insects and small nocturnal creatures. I walked back to my truck, planning to settle into my sleeper cab for a few hours of rest, but movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. The other trucks in the parking area sat silent and dark, but I could swear I'd seen a figure moving between them, just at the edge of the light's reach. I called out a friendly greeting, the way truckers do when we encounter each other in these lonely places, but received no response. The silence seemed to swallow my words like a hungry mouth, leaving not even an echo to keep them company. I stood there for a moment, listening carefully, but heard only the subtle sounds of the rest stop itself, the hum of electricity, the whisper of air conditioning units, and something else I couldn't quite identify, a rhythmic sound almost like breathing. Climbing up into my cab, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had begun to settle over me like a heavy blanket. Fatigue could play tricks on a driver's mind, I reminded myself, creating shadows and sounds where none existed. I'd experienced it before during long hauls, that peculiar state where exhaustion and isolation conspired to make reality feel thin and unreliable. I settled into my bunk, pulled the curtains closed, and tried to focus on the simple pleasure of finally lying down after so many hours upright. Sleep came quickly, falling over me like a dark curtain, but it brought with it dreams that felt more real than the waking world I'd left behind. In my dreams, I was still at the rest stop, but it had transformed into something ancient and hungry. The building stretched impossibly tall, its walls covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. The parking lot had become a vast maze of trucks, all identical to mine, stretching endlessly in every direction like some nightmare version of a used car lot. In the dream, I walked among these trucks, searching for my own rig, but each one I approached would suddenly start its engine and drive away, leaving me more lost and confused than before. The sound of diesel engines filled the air, a mechanical symphony that grew louder and more discordant with each passing moment. Other drivers wandered through this maze as well, their faces pale and drawn with exhaustion, their eyes reflecting a deep, bone-weary tiredness that seemed to go far beyond simple lack of sleep. I tried to speak to them, to ask for directions back to my truck, but when they opened their mouths, only the sound of idling engines emerged, a low rumbling that vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. Their movements were slow and deliberate, as if they were fighting against some invisible force that sought to hold them in place. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered and buzzed, casting everything in an unstable, stuttering illumination that made shadows dance and leap like living things. The dream began to fracture and dissolve around the edges, reality bleeding through like water through a cracked dam, and I found myself surfacing toward wakefulness, with the slow, disorienting rise of a deep-sea diver returning to the surface. But even as consciousness returned, the sounds from my dream seemed to follow me, the rumble of engines and the mechanical breathing that had permeated my sleep continuing even after my eyes opened in the darkness of my sleeper cab. I lay still for a moment, trying to orient myself and separate dream from reality, when I realized that the sounds weren't fading as dream sounds should. The rumble of engines was real, coming from somewhere outside my truck, accompanied by the slow, rhythmic sound I'd noticed earlier but now recognized with growing horror, as the wheeze and gasp of labored breathing amplified through some kind of mechanical system. Pulling back the curtain slightly, I peered out into the rest stop's parking area, and what I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. The other trucks were no longer parked in their original positions. They had moved closer to mine, forming a loose circle around my Peterbilt like massive metal predators closing in on prey. Their engines idled with a synchronized rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat, and their headlights cast intersecting beams that trapped my truck in a web of harsh white light. But it was the drivers that truly terrified me. They stood beside their trucks, perfectly still and silent, their faces turned toward my cab with expressions of such profound exhaustion that it seemed to radiate from them like heat from a furnace. Their eyes were open but vacant, staring with the empty gaze of sleepwalkers, and their mouths hung slightly agape as if they were trying to breathe through water. They looked like people who had been driving for days or weeks without rest, pushed far beyond the normal limits of human endurance into some twilight state between waking and sleeping. As I watched in growing terror, one of them began to walk toward my truck with the slow, measured pace of someone moving underwater. His movements were too smooth, too controlled, lacking the natural variations that mark living motion. Behind him, the others began to follow, maintaining their perfect formation as they approached my Peterbilt with the patient inevitability of a rising tide. I started my engine with hands that shook so badly I could barely turn the key, the familiar rumble of my diesel providing a small comfort in the face of this waking nightmare. But as my engine joined the chorus of the other trucks, I felt something change in the air around me, as if my truck had somehow become part of whatever force controlled this place. The exhaustion I'd felt earlier returned with doubled intensity, weighing down my eyelids and making my limbs feel heavy and unresponsive. Fighting against the overwhelming urge to simply give in to sleep, I threw my truck into gear and pressed the accelerator, desperate to escape before whatever held those other drivers could claim me as well. My Peterbilt lurched forward, but the circle of trucks began mile marker 0. From Jake Morrison, the thing about driving the same route for 15 years is that you know every mile marker, every bend, every pothole like the back of your weathered hands. Interstate 49 through Louisiana had been my ribbon of asphalt since I started hauling lumber from Shreveport to New Orleans, and I could navigate it half asleep if I had to. The familiar green signs with their white numbers had become old friends marking my progress through the humid darkness, counting down the miles like a slow heartbeat through the bayou country. But October night started like any other, my Peterbilt 339 humming along at a steady 65, the diesel engine's rhythmic purr mixing with the soft patter of mist against the windshield. The load of pine boards behind me was secure, and I was making good time despite the fog that had started rolling in around Lafayette. My CB radio crackled occasionally with distant trucker chatter, but mostly it was just me, the road, and the hypnotic sweep of my headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. I just passed mile marker 87 when I first noticed something odd. The next marker, which should have been 86, seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision as I approached. Not the usual steady reflection of my headlights, but an actual flicker, like a fluorescent bulb struggling to stay lit. I slowed down slightly, squinting through the windshield as the green sign came into clearer view. Mile marker 86, just as it should be, standing perfectly normal beside the roadway. Must be tired, I thought, reaching for my thermos of coffee. The hot liquid helped clear my head, and I pressed on through the thickening fog. The radio weather report had mentioned possible ground fog, but this seemed heavier than usual, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, more intimate. The mile markers continued their steady countdown, 85, 84, 83. Each one appearing briefly in my headlight beam before disappearing into the murky darkness behind me. It was at mile marker 78 that things got genuinely strange. As I approached, the numbers seemed to shimmer, the white reflective paint appearing to move and shift like liquid mercury. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with one hand while keeping the other steady on the wheel. When I looked again, the sign read 78 clear as day, but I could have sworn that for just a moment, it had shown something else entirely. Something that didn't make sense. The fog was getting thicker now, reducing my visibility to maybe 100 yards ahead. I clicked on my fog lights and reduced my speed to 55. The responsible thing to do, even though every instinct told me to get through this stretch as quickly as possible. The mile markers continued their progression, 77, 76, 75, but each one seemed to take longer to reach than it should have. I checked my speedometer repeatedly, confirming that I was maintaining a steady pace, yet the distance between markers felt stretched, elongated in ways that defied logic. At mile marker 72, I pulled out my phone to check the time. The digital clock read 2:17 a.m., which seemed about right for my position on the route, but something nagged at me. A feeling that I'd been driving longer than I should have been. I tried to remember passing the last major landmark, the truck stop at mile marker 93, but the memory felt fuzzy, uncertain. The fog seemed to be seeping into my thoughts as well as surrounding my truck. Mile marker 68 appeared normal enough, but as I passed it and looked in my side mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the red glow of my taillights, the number on the sign appeared to be counting backward, cycling through digits like some kind of digital display gone haywire. 68, 67, 66. the numbers spinning faster and faster until they became a blur of white light against the green background. It jerked my attention back to the road ahead, my heart hammering against my ribs. The speedometer needle was steady at 55, the engine temperature normal, everything mechanical about my truck functioning perfect, but the world outside had taken on a dreamlike quality, as if the fog wasn't just obscuring the landscape but actively changing it. The trees that should have lined the highway seemed different, their shapes twisted and unfamiliar. When mile marker 65 came into view, I nearly slammed on the brakes. The sign was there exactly where it should be, but it wasn't alone. Stretching out behind it, disappearing into the fog like a line of ghostly sentinels, were dozens of other mile markers, all bearing the same number, 65. Row after row of identical green signs, each one reflecting my headlights with that same unsettling shimmer. I forced myself to keep driving, to maintain speed and composure even as reality seemed to bend around me. The CB radio had gone completely silent, not even the usual background static. I tried keying the mic, calling out for any other drivers who might be in the area, but received no response. The radio seemed to be working fine, the power light glowing steadily, but it was as if I was broadcasting into a void. The mile markers ahead resumed their normal appearance and spacing, but the countdown had become erratic. After 65 came 61, then 59, as if several miles had simply been skipped over. I checked my fuel gauge nervously, wondering if somehow I was burning diesel faster than normal, but the needle showed exactly what it should for this stretch of highway. Everything about my truck remained perfectly normal, while the world outside descended into impossibility. At what should have been mile marker 45, I encountered something that made me question my sanity entirely. The sign read mile 0, in those same familiar white reflective numbers, but mile 0 didn't exist on this highway. The interstate didn't start or end anywhere near this location, and certainly not in the middle of the Louisiana wetlands. Yet there it stood, as solid and official looking as any other marker, marking the beginning and end of something I couldn't comprehend. Beyond mile marker 0, the highway stretched on into the fog exactly as it had before, but something fundamental had changed. The pavement seemed newer, smoother, and the yellow center lines glowed with an intensity that hurt to look at directly. My truck's engine note had changed subtly, developing a harmonic that I'd never heard before, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. The next mile marker I encountered read mile 1, and my hands began to shake on the steering wheel. Negative mile markers were beyond impossible. They were absurd, yet here I was passing signs that counted backward into negative numbers, -2, -3, -4, each one accompanied by subtle changes in the landscape that my eyes couldn't quite focus on, but my mind registered with growing alarm. At mile marker -7, I saw headlights approaching in my mirrors. Finally, another vehicle, proof that I hadn't slipped entirely from reality. But as the lights drew closer, I realized they were matching my speed exactly, neither gaining nor falling behind. I tried speeding up, and the lights maintained their distance. I slowed down, and they slowed with me, as if connected by some invisible tether. The pursuing vehicle never quite got close enough for me to make out its shape clearly. Through the fog and darkness, I could only see those twin points of light, steady and relentless. My CB radio suddenly crackled to life, filled with a voice that sounded disturbingly like my own, calling out my truck's position at mile markers that didn't exist, reporting road conditions that made no sense. I realized then that I had to get out of this impossible stretch of highway, had to find a way back to the real interstate. At mile marker -12, I saw an exit ramp materializing out of the fog to my right, unlabeled and unlit, but offering the only escape from this countdown into nowhere. Without hesitation, I cranked the wheel and took the ramp, my trailer swaying slightly as we left the main highway. The exit curved sharply upward, rising through the fog like a concrete rainbow, and as I climbed, the mysterious headlights behind me faded away. At the top of the ramp, another roadway intersected, and I could see normal mile markers stretching away in both directions. I chose the direction that felt like south and pressed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between myself and that impossible negative highway. And when I finally saw a familiar landmark, a 24-hour truck stop that I'd used countless times before, I pulled in and parked with shaking hands. The clock on the fuel island read 2:19 a.m., just 2 minutes later than when I'd checked my phone at mile marker 72. According to my logbook, I should have traveled nearly 40 miles in those 2 minutes, but my fuel gauge showed exactly the consumption I'd expect for normal highway driving. It never reported what happened that night, never tried to explain the impossible mile markers, or the road that counted backward into negative numbers. But sometimes, when the fog rolls thick across Interstate 49, I catch glimpses of mile marker 0 in my peripheral vision, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights,